The tire tracks didn't belong there. That was the first thing Cole Drayden noticed when he came around the bend in his Forest Service pickup just after 7 in the morning, the high desert light still low and amber, stretching long shadows across the caliche dust of the access road. He'd driven this stretch of the Harlow Basin every week for 11 years, and he knew, the way you know the lines in your own hand, exactly what should and shouldn't be disturbed out here. A pair of deep tread impressions cut fresh into the pale earth, heading toward the old Harlow Quarry perimeter fence. Not a ranger vehicle, not a maintenance truck, something wider, something heavy. He stopped the pickup, killed the engine, and sat listening for a moment. Whined through the juniper. A meadowlark somewhere off in the scrub. Nothing mechanical. Whatever made those tracks had come and gone, or come and stopped. Cole was 43 years old. He'd spent more than a decade patrolling this stretch of the Harlow Basin Wilderness Reserve, a 60,000-acre block of high desert and broken canyon country in the remote eastern corner of the state. He'd found lost hikers and stolen ATVs and the occasional meth cook who thought the backcountry was far enough from anyone's attention. He was not an excitable man, the kind of person who processed first and reacted second, who trusted his instincts but checked them against evidence before he said a word. He got out of the truck, crouched beside the tracks, and studied the tread pattern for a long moment. Heavy vehicle, dual rear axle, judging by the width. Came in sometime in the last 12 hours, given how the edges of the impressions hadn't crumbled yet in the morning wind. He followed the tracks on foot toward the quarry fence. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The Harlow Quarry had been closed since 1987. Before that, for almost 40 years, it had produced aggregate stone for road construction across the basin, a deep open pit operation carved into the earth like an open wound, roughly 300 meters across at the surface and dropping nearly 60 meters to the quarry floor. When the Harlow Mining Company went bankrupt, the reclamation never happened. The state had padlocked the gate, posted warning signs, and more or less forgotten the place existed. The Basin Wilderness designation that came later in the 90s absorbed the quarry land into the reserve boundary, which meant Cole was technically responsible for it along with everything else out here. He'd looked into the pit dozens of times over the years, standing at the edge and watching rainwater collect at the bottom in wet seasons, watching it evaporate to a mineral crust in dry ones. There was nothing down there. There had never been anything down there except rock and water and the slow work of time. The tracks led straight to the gate. The padlock was cut. A fresh cut, the metal still bright where the bolt cutters had bitten through. The chain had been looped back through the gate hasp to make it appear locked from a distance, but it fell free in Cole's hand when he pulled it. He stood at the open gate and looked down the deteriorating service road that switchbacked along the quarry wall toward the floor 60 meters below. The tracks continued down. He went back to his truck and called it in. Dispatch acknowledged, told him to hold position and wait for backup. Standard protocol for unknown vehicle situations. Cole said yes, ma'am, and sat in the truck for about 4 minutes. Then he drove through the gate and started down the switchback. He wasn't reckless. He called in, backup was coming, and he drove slowly with his windows down and his radio on his hip. But something about those tracks and the cut lock and the careful way the chain had been replaced to fool a passing eye, that deliberateness bothered him in a way he couldn't leave alone. People who cut locks and disguised the cut and drove down into a 60-meter pit in the dead of night were not people doing something innocent. The switchback road was rougher than he remembered from his last inspection, erosion having eaten at the edges in a couple of places, requiring him to ease the truck through carefully. The quarry walls rose on his left as he descended. The banded rock strata he'd looked at 100 times, pale limestone and darker basalt in alternating layers, the geological history of the basin written in stone. The morning light dropped away as he went lower, the high walls throwing the floor into a kind of permanent early dusk, even at 7 in the morning. He came around the final bend, onto the quarry floor, and stopped the truck. There were 2 vehicles. A dark green cargo van with no plates, backed up against the far wall of the quarry. And beside it, an older model pickup, also plateless, its bed covered with a blue tarp. Both vehicles were empty. He could see that from where he sat. No one behind the wheels. No movement. Cole sat with his hand resting on the door handle for a long moment. 60 meters of rock wall surrounding him on all sides. One road in and out. Backup still 20, maybe 25 minutes away. He got out of the truck. What he found over the next 10 minutes changed everything he thought he knew about the Harlow Basin, about the people who'd passed through it, and about the particular kind of cruelty that could be hidden in plain sight for years. But to understand what was at the bottom of that quarry, you first have to understand how it came to be there. And for that, you have to go back 14 years to a family that most of the world had never heard of, in a situation so desperate that a man with no good options had made a choice that would echo for more than a decade through the lives of people he'd never met. His name was Raymond Voss. He was 51 years old when the bottom fell out, a third-generation rancher from the basin's western edge, running cattle on land his grandfather had homesteaded in the 1920s. He had a wife named Darlene and two sons, Marcus and Joel, 17 and 14 at the time. He had a ranch of about 1,200 acres, a small herd, equipment that was old but functional, and debts that had been accumulating since the drought years of the early 2000s had hit the basin's ranchers like a slow-motion disaster. Raymond Voss was not a wealthy man and had never been, but he'd managed. He knew how to manage. His father had taught him that the land gave you what you needed if you were patient and careful and didn't ask for more than it could provide. What he'd never been taught was how to deal with the kind of people who came to the basin in the mid-2000s with investment money and land acquisition strategies, and lawyers who knew how to work the fine print of a distressed rancher's loan documents. The company was called Basin Meridian Land Partners. They had an office in a city 300 miles away, a website with stock photography of rolling grasslands, and a strategy that Cole, much later, would describe to a state investigator as predatory in the most clinical sense of the word. They bought distressed debt from struggling ranchers across the basin, waited for payments to lapse, and converted that debt into land through foreclosure mechanisms that were entirely legal and entirely devastating. By 2008, they had absorbed 11 ranches across the basin's western sector. The Voss Ranch was the 12th on their list. Raymond had taken a loan against the ranch in 2004 to cover feed costs during the drought. The loan was originally held by a regional bank that he'd dealt with for 20 years, people who knew him and knew the land and understood that ranching in the basin ran on weather cycles that didn't respect quarterly payment schedules. That bank sold the loan to Basin Meridian in 2007 without so much as a letter to Raymond. The first he knew about it was when a representative from Basin Meridian appeared at his door to introduce themselves as his new creditors. The rate adjustments they proposed were not adjustments. They were a mechanism. Cole would come to understand that clearly later. But all of that is context. The event that set everything in motion happened in the autumn of 2009, when Raymond Voss, facing the imminent loss of his family's land and believing he had exhausted every legal avenue, made a different kind of decision. He disappeared. That was how the county sheriff's office logged it at the time. Raymond Voss, 51, failed to appear for a creditor's hearing, and when deputies went to the ranch, they found Darlene Voss and her two sons and a note on the kitchen table that said he was sorry, that he loved them, and that he couldn't watch them lose everything. Darlene told the deputies he'd been under severe strain. She genuinely believed, or said she believed, that he might have done something to harm himself. A search was conducted. The ranch, the surrounding land, the creek drainage. Nothing was found. Raymond Voss was logged as a missing person. A year later, with no evidence of foul play and no body, the case went into a file drawer. Basin Meridian completed the foreclosure 4 months after Raymond's disappearance. Darlene and her sons moved into a rental in the nearest town, 26 miles from the ranch, where 3 generations of Voss men had worked the same ground. Marcus graduated high school the following spring and left the state for a construction job in the Northwest. Joel stayed close to his mother, finished school, got work at a feed store in town. Darlene cleaned houses. She never remarried. She never stopped believing, or saying she believed, that Raymond had walked away rather than face the loss, that he was somewhere alive. When people asked, she said she didn't blame him. She understood. She just wished he'd told her he was leaving. Cole Drayden had known the Voss family the way you know people in small communities, not closely, but by name and sight and the general shape of their lives. He'd been a seasonal ranger when Raymond disappeared, not yet full-time, and the disappearance had registered as one of those basin tragedies that accumulated slowly over the years like sediment. Another family broken by drought and debt and bad luck. He'd felt bad about it and moved on. That was the honest truth of it. He hadn't thought about Raymond Voss in probably 7 years when he stepped out of his truck on the floor of the Harlow Quarry on that November morning and started walking toward the two plateless vehicles. The cargo van's rear doors were not latched. They hung slightly open, the gap not wide enough to see inside clearly, just enough to suggest that whoever had used the van last had left in a hurry or hadn't cared enough to close things properly. Cole approached from the side, one hand on the radio at his hip. He reached the rear of the van and pulled the door open with his left hand. Inside were documents, dozens of them, stacked in cardboard file boxes, some open, papers fanned across the van floor as though someone had been working through them and abandoned the task partway. At first, he didn't understand what he was looking at. Forms, letters, what appeared to be financial records. Then he crouched and picked up the nearest sheet and read it, and the name at the top of the letterhead stopped him cold. Basin Meridian Land Partners. He stood there for a moment with the paper in his hand and the morning quiet around him and tried to work out what he was seeing. Then he walked around to the other vehicle, the pickup, and pulled back the tarp on the bed. He called 911 6 seconds later. Not dispatch, not his supervisor. 911, because what was under that tarp was not a land acquisition file or a financial record or anything that fell under the Forest Service's jurisdiction. What was under that tarp was a box. A metal strongbox, old, the kind with a hasp lock and a serial number stamped on the lid, about the size of a large suitcase. And the box was not what made him call 911. The box was open, and what was inside the box, wrapped in plastic sheeting and duct tape, arranged with a care that had a particular quality to it that made the hair on his arm stand up in the cool morning air. He didn't touch anything else. He walked back to his truck, sat down, and waited for the world to arrive. It arrived fast. The first county sheriff's deputy reached the quarry floor 40 minutes later. 2 more behind him. Then a state patrol sergeant. Then, by early afternoon, a detective from the county major crimes unit named Sandra Briggs, a compact woman in her mid-50s with close-cropped gray hair and the patient, unhurried manner of someone who had learned that the facts would surface on their own schedule and that rushing them only made them harder to read clearly. She stood at the cargo van's open rear doors for a long time before she spoke. "These documents are organized," she said to her deputy. "Someone sorted these." Cole was standing nearby, having given his initial statement twice and been told to remain on scene. He watched her work through the file boxes with gloved hands, pulling folders, reading headings, setting things aside in a pattern he couldn't yet follow. She had a method. He could see that. She was building something in her head as she went, and whatever she was building was either very large or very complicated, because she worked in silence for the better part of an hour before she said anything else. What she said was, "Get me the missing persons database for this county going back 20 years. The deputy looked at her. "All of them," she said. "Not just open cases." What Cole didn't know yet, what Detective Briggs was beginning to piece together from the documents in the van and the contents of the strongbox, was that the Harlow Quarry had not been as unused as everyone believed. The quarry had been quietly reactivated, not for stone, and not by anyone with a permit or a plan on file with the state. What had been happening at the Harlow Quarry, on and off, for a period that the documents in the van suggested stretched back at least 9 years, was something that the basin's residents would spend a long time trying to understand after the news broke. It started with Raymond Voss. That much became clear early. But Raymond Voss was not the end of it. Briggs worked the scene for 6 hours before she let the forensics team move in. Cole stayed the whole time, having been technically placed on administrative hold pending the investigation, which meant he wasn't supposed to leave without clearing it with Briggs first. He sat on the tailgate of his truck and drank coffee from a thermos and watched the process unfold with the particular kind of attention he brought to things in the field, not staring, not intrusive, but present and observant, and absorbing details that he couldn't yet connect into a shape he recognized. At around 2 in the afternoon, a second detective arrived from the State Bureau. A tall man named Garrett Oakes, who had apparently worked financial crimes before transferring to the Bureau's Serious Crimes Division. He and Briggs spoke for a long time beside the cargo van, too quietly for Cole to hear. Then Oakes went to the van and spent another 40 minutes with the files. When he emerged, his expression had the particular flatness of a person who has confirmed something they hoped they wouldn't confirm. He walked over to where Cole was sitting. "You've been out here 11 years? Oakes said. "About that. You ever see anything out of the ordinary at this quarry? Vehicles, activity, anything that struck you as off?" Cole thought about it honestly. Once, about 6 years back, he'd seen what he thought were tire tracks near the gate, but hadn't followed up because the lock had appeared intact. He'd assumed it was someone who'd come up to the gate, realized it was locked, and turned around. He told Oakes that. Oakes wrote it down, looked at him for a moment. "You know the name Raymond Voss?" Cole said yes. Said he knew the family, roughly. Knew Raymond had gone missing in 2009. Oakes nodded slowly. He was quiet for a few seconds. Then he said, "We're going to be out here for a while." That was all he said. But the way he said it, the weight of it, the particular heaviness of a man who had just looked at something he couldn't unsee, was enough to tell Cole that whatever had started with Raymond Voss and a set of fresh tire tracks on a November morning had not started or ended with any of the things that were visible from where they were standing. The forensics team worked through the afternoon and into the evening under portable lights. Cole was finally cleared to leave at around 7, told to make himself available for further questioning and not to discuss what he'd seen with anyone outside the investigation. He drove the switchback road back up to the surface and came out into the high desert dark, the stars enormous overhead, the basin spread out below him in both directions, silent and enormous and unchanged. He sat in the truck for a while before he started the engine. 11 years of patrols, thousands of miles of access roads and fire breaks and canyon trails. And 60 meters below the surface, 100 yards from a road he'd driven every week, something had been waiting. Not waiting, he corrected himself. Being kept. There was a difference. He wasn't sure yet what it was, but he felt it. He drove home. He didn't sleep well. By the following morning, the State Bureau had full jurisdiction, which was how investigations of this particular type worked when they crossed county lines, which this one had already done before most people knew it existed. Briggs stayed on as the county liaison. Oakes ran the state end. A third investigator, a forensic accountant named Claire Norrish, who specialized in land fraud and asset concealment, was brought in from the State Financial Crimes Unit before the end of the first week. Cole knew none of this in real time. He knew it later, the way most people in the basin came to know it, in pieces as the investigation allowed information to surface. What he did know, because Oakes told him during a follow-up interview on day 3, was that the documents in the cargo van were records from Basin Meridian Land Partners. Not copies. Originals. The kind that would be kept in a corporate office, in locked files, under the control of the company's principals. The kind that were not supposed to be in a cargo van in an abandoned quarry. Oakes had a theory about why they were there. He didn't share the theory with Cole directly, but the questions he asked made it fairly clear what shape it took. He wanted to know about the quarry's accessibility. He wanted to know about traffic patterns in the basin, which roads were monitored and which weren't, whether someone could move between the quarry and the Western Basin ranches without passing a camera or a staffed ranger station. Cole answered honestly and thoroughly and came away from the interview with a distinct sense that what he'd found was not a beginning. It was a middle. The beginning had happened a long time ago. The Voss family learned about the quarry discovery on the afternoon of the third day, when Briggs drove out to the rental house where Darlene Voss had been living for the past 14 years and asked if she could come inside and sit down. Darlene was 64 years old. She'd aged the way people age when they've been carrying something heavy for a very long time. Not broken, but compressed, every movement careful and deliberate and slightly effortful. She'd cleaned houses until her knees wouldn't let her anymore, and then she'd taken in alterations and mending, sitting at a table by the window with a lamp and a needle and the quiet that had settled over her life like weather. Joel came around twice a week. Marcus called from the Northwest on Sundays. She had a cat named Pepper and a small garden and a faith that she'd long since stopped expecting to be rewarded but hadn't been able to put down either. She let Briggs in and sat across from her at the kitchen table and folded her hands and waited. Briggs told her what they'd found at the quarry. She told her carefully and without evasion, the way Cole would come to understand she did most things, directly, but not without compassion. She told Darlene that Raymond had been found, that he had not walked away, that he had not chosen to leave. Darlene Voss sat very still for a long time after that. Then she said, "I knew." Briggs waited. "I knew he wouldn't have left Joel," Darlene said. "Not Joel. Marcus was older. Marcus could manage. But Joel was 14, and Raymond knew that. He would never have walked away from a 14-year-old boy who needed him. I told myself I believed it, because I didn't know what else to believe. But I knew." She asked Briggs if it had been quick. Briggs told her what she could tell her, which was limited by what forensics had established so far, but enough to give Darlene an answer that was true if incomplete. Joel Voss arrived at the house 40 minutes later, called by his mother from the kitchen while Briggs waited in the living room. He was 28 now, a compact, quiet young man with his father's dark eyes and a kind of stillness that suggested he'd made his peace with uncertainty a long time ago, or had at least found a way to carry it. He sat beside his mother and listened to Briggs cover the same ground again, and then he asked one question. Was it connected to the foreclosure? Briggs told him that the investigation was ongoing and she couldn't confirm specifics yet, but that the documents found at the scene related to Basin Meridian Land Partners were a significant focus of the investigation. Joel nodded slowly. He looked at his hands. "I've thought about those people every day for 14 years, he said. "Not the company, the specific people, the ones who came to the house. I was 14, and I watched my dad try to talk to them about the loan, and I watched the way they looked at him, like he was an inconvenience. Not a person, an obstacle in a process." He looked up at Briggs. "I need you to tell me who did this." Briggs told him she intended to. What neither Joel nor Darlene knew yet, what Briggs and Oakes and Claire Norrish were working through in the Basin's county seat with boxes of original Basin Meridian records spread across a conference room table, was that Raymond Voss was not the only name connected to those files. The documents from the cargo van contained records for 14 land transactions across the basin's western sector, spanning nearly a decade of acquisitions. 12 of them were standard foreclosure proceedings, ugly and predatory, but within the legal framework that Basin Meridian had carefully constructed. 2 of them were different. The difference was not in the outcome. Both properties had been acquired. The difference was in the process, and in the paper trail that Basin Meridian's principals had apparently kept, either from habit or compulsion or the particular arrogance of people who believe their arrangements are permanent, records documenting arrangements that went well beyond the legal mechanisms they'd used everywhere else. Raymond Voss was one of the 2. The other was a woman named Patricia Hollowell, 67 at the time of the transaction in 2011, a widow who'd owned 40 acres on the basin's northern rim, where she'd lived alone since her husband's death in 2004. Her property sat on the access corridor Basin Meridian needed to connect 2 of their largest acquisitions into a contiguous holding, the kind of contiguous holding that unlocked a particular category of federal grazing lease they'd been building toward for years. Patricia Hollowell had refused to sell, twice, at offers that were, by any objective measure, below the property's value even in a down market. Patricia Hollowell had been reported missing in October of 2011. She'd had no children, no close family in the state. A neighbor had noticed her mail accumulating and called the sheriff, who'd conducted a search and found nothing, and logged the case as a missing person with a note in the file suggesting possible voluntary departure, possible cognitive decline. She'd been 72 at the time. Her property had passed to the state after a mandatory waiting period and had been acquired by Basin Meridian through a process that the state records described as a standard escheat transaction. Claire Norrish had found the Hollowell connection on the second day, working through the acquisition timeline and noticing the gap where a voluntary transaction should have been. She'd pulled the missing person file and sat with it for a long time. Then she'd gone to find Oakes. By the end of the first week, the quarry was still an active crime scene. The Basin's small-town information network had begun producing the kind of low-level rumor that spreads through communities when something large and dark has surfaced, but the details haven't yet been released. Cole heard things at the gas station and at the ranger station and from a neighbor whose cousin worked at the county courthouse. None of the things he heard were accurate in their specifics, but the general shape of them was close enough to what he knew that it gave him a strange feeling, the sense of watching a story form itself out of fragments in real time, imperfect and approximate, but moving in the right direction. He was called in for a third interview on day 8, this time with both Briggs and Oakes present, and this time the questions were different. They weren't about the quarry's physical access or the basin's road network. They were about Basin Meridian. What did he know about the company's operations in the basin? Had he ever encountered their personnel in the field? Had he seen vehicles associated with them on the reserve lands? Cole told them what he knew, which was general knowledge, the acquisitions, the consolidation of holdings on the western sector, the rumors about the federal grazing lease play that had circulated among ranchers for years. He told them about a conversation he'd had with Raymond Voss, once, about 3 months before Raymond disappeared. He'd been checking a fence line near the Voss ranch boundary, and Raymond had come out to talk, and they'd stood for a while in the afternoon sun, and Raymond had been quiet for a long time before he said that he'd found something. Something in the loan documents. Something he was going to take to a lawyer. Cole had told him that was a good idea and gone on with his fence line check. He'd thought about that conversation a great deal in the years since Raymond disappeared, had wondered if the something Raymond found had anything to do with why he'd gone, but had never been able to connect it to anything concrete. Oakes listened to this without expression. Then he asked Cole if Raymond had said anything more specific about what he'd found. He said there were 2 sets of books, Cole said. That was the phrase he used. He said he'd found the second set, and he didn't think the company knew he had it. Oakes and Briggs exchanged a look that Cole couldn't read. What happened after that, over the following 3 weeks, was the kind of investigative unfolding that Cole would later describe as watching a building come down in slow motion. Each piece of information that surfaced brought more structure into view, and with each new piece it became clearer that the structure was larger than anyone had initially understood. The documents in the cargo van were not Basin Meridian's only records. They were the records someone had tried to move in a hurry, in the dark, to a location they believed was forgotten and inaccessible. The attempt to move them was itself evidence of consciousness of guilt, which was how Norrish described it in her report, a legal phrase that Cole had to look up but understood intuitively when he read the definition. Someone knew what those records contained. Someone had understood, on the night Cole found the tire tracks, that the situation had changed and that certain things needed to disappear. The question was who, and whether they'd been fast enough. They hadn't been fast enough. The principal of Basin Meridian Land Partners was a man named Douglas Cahill, 63, who operated out of an office in a city 300 miles away and had, by all external appearances, spent the past 2 decades as a moderately successful commercial real estate developer. He had a house in a gated community and a boat and 2 adult children and a LinkedIn profile that described him in a language of professional accomplishment. He also had a partner, a man named Terrence Aldis, who handled the operational side of the land acquisitions, which was a way of describing a role that the investigation would eventually document in considerable detail. On the morning of day 11, Cole got a call from Oakes telling him that 2 arrests had been made in connection with the Harlow Quarry investigation and that he'd be informed of further developments as they became available for public release. Cole thanked him and sat with the phone in his hand for a while after the call ended. He drove out to the quarry that afternoon, not down to the floor, the scene was still active, but to the gate at the top, where he stood for a while looking down the switchback at the quarry walls and the floor visible from the rim. The light was different than it had been 11 days ago. Lower, colder, the shadows longer. In a few weeks the basin would get its first frost, and the high country would go white, and the access roads would require chains. He thought about Raymond Voss standing in the afternoon sun near the ranch boundary, quiet for a long time before he spoke. He thought about the second set of books and whatever Raymond had found in them and the decision he'd apparently made to take it to a lawyer, which was a kind of decision that a certain type of person cannot afford to let happen. He thought about Joel Voss at 28, sitting beside his mother with his father's eyes and 14 years of uncertainty finally resolving into something terrible but solid. The worst kind of answer, but an answer. There was a long way still to go. Cole understood that. Investigations of this complexity, with this many threads and this many years of accumulated concealment to unpick, did not resolve in 11 days or 11 weeks. There would be legal proceedings and forensic accounting and testimony and the slow machinery of accountability working through its process. There would be things that came out and things that remained unclear, and the particular incompleteness that attended all human attempts to reconstruct what had happened in the dark. But the tire tracks had led somewhere. The cut lock had been found. The records in the cargo van had not reached wherever they were being taken. Cole Drayden had come around a bend in a high desert access road on a November morning and seen something that didn't belong there and followed it down. That was what he'd done. That was what he did. He stood at the quarry rim a while longer. Then he got back in his truck and drove the patrol route, the same 60,000 acres he'd driven for 11 years, the junipers and the caliche and the big empty sky overhead, watching for what was out of place, which was the whole of the job and had always been the whole of the job. He didn't know yet what the next weeks would bring. He didn't know the full shape of what had been buried, or all the people connected to it, or the distance the truth would have to travel before it reached the people who needed it most. He didn't know about the ledger that Norrish would find in the second layer of the strongbox's contents, or the names in the ledger, or what those names would mean to 3 families across the basin who'd spent years believing different versions of story that had only one true version. He didn't know about the connection to the state land office that would surface in week 4, or the pension fund investments that ran through Basin Meridian's holding structure and tied a web of financial institutions to the quarry's contents in ways that a forensic accountant would spend months tracing. He didn't know any of that yet, but he'd found the tire tracks. In a job that was mostly maintenance and routine and the patient repetition of roads driven hundreds of times, he'd noticed the one morning that was different from all the others, and he'd followed it. That was how it started. That was always how it started. The ledger was the thing that broke the case open, not the documents in the cargo van, which were damning enough on their own terms, and not the strongbox, which had confirmed what the quarry floor meant and started the criminal process in motion. Those were the beginning. The ledger was something else. The ledger was the map. Claire Norrish found it on day 14, working late in the conference room at the county seat with the strongbox contents spread across a folding table under fluorescent light. She'd already processed the first layer, the financial records and correspondence that documented the Cahill and Aldis operation in clinical detail, their acquisition structure, their loan mechanisms, their relationships with the bank officers who'd facilitated the debt transfers. That material was going to matter enormously in the eventual proceedings. But it was accountant material, transaction records, and paper trails, and while it told a story, it told it in the language of ledger lines and wire transfers, a language that required translation before it meant anything to the people it had most directly affected. The second layer was different. It was a notebook, spiral-bound, the kind you could buy at any drugstore, its cover plain black with no label. Norrish had almost set it aside as personal property, something one of the van's occupants had left behind. But she opened it because she opened everything, and what she found inside was not personal in any ordinary sense. It was a record, handwritten in a small, precise script that she would later identify as belonging to Terrence Aldis. Dates going back 9 years. Locations, names, and beside each name, a number and a notation in a shorthand that took her about 40 minutes to decode, working through the patterns until the system became clear. She called Oakes at 11:30 at night. He was at the conference room by midnight. They sat with the notebook between them and worked through it together, and by 2 in the morning they understood that Douglas Cahill and Terrence Aldis had not been operating alone. The notebook contained the names of 6 other individuals connected to the Basin Meridian enterprise across its 9-year span of operations in the basin. Not employees, not contractors in any standard sense. People who had been present. People who had provided specific services at specific times, and who had been compensated through a system of payments that ran through a shell entity that Norrish had already identified in the financial records, but hadn't yet connected to its purpose. The payments were small, individually, the kind of amounts that didn't trigger automatic reporting thresholds, the kind of amounts that a forensic accountant with 22 years of experience looked at and recognized immediately as deliberate, calibrated to stay invisible. Norrish had seen similar structures in other cases, organized fraud operations, tax concealment schemes, the occasional organized crime-adjacent enterprise that had tried to professionalize its record-keeping. She had not expected to find it here, in a spiral notebook in a metal box at the bottom of a quarry in a high desert basin where the nearest interstate was 90 miles away. She had not expected any of this, but she'd stopped being surprised by what turned up in quiet places a long time ago. Among the 6 names in the notebook was a man named Gerald Pruitt, 58, who had worked as a contractor for the county road department for 21 years and whose specific value to the Basin Meridian operation, as Norrish and Oakes worked out from the notebook's notations, had been access. His road department credentials gave him legitimate reason to be on rural access roads at unusual hours, to operate heavy equipment in remote areas, to come and go from locations like the Harlow Quarry without attracting attention. The tire tracks Cole had found were consistent with road department equipment. That connection, once Norrish flagged it, took Oakes about 4 hours to run down. There is also a man named Stuart Farwell, 61, a former deputy sheriff who'd retired in 2013 and now operated a small security consulting business. His role in the notebook's notations was less clearly defined but appeared to relate to information, specifically to what was in investigation files and when. The missing person cases for Raymond Voss and Patricia Hollowell had both moved to inactive status faster than their circumstances technically warranted. The detective who'd handled the Hollowell case had retired 6 months after the case went inactive. Farwell's name appeared in the notebook 3 times in the period surrounding the Hollowell disappearance. Oakes sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "This is a long way from a land fraud case," he said. Norrish was already writing up the summary for the bureau director. She didn't look up. "It was always a long way from a land fraud case," she said. "They just don't start that way." Cole heard about the notebook the way he heard about most things during those weeks, sideways and incomplete, a comment from the county sheriff's liaison officer during a routine check-in about the reserve's access roads. The liaison mentioned that the investigation had expanded and that additional arrests were expected, and that the timeline of known activity at the quarry now extended back further than initially believed. Cole listened to all of this and drove home and sat in his kitchen and thought about Patricia Hollowell, whose name he'd known only vaguely until a colleague had mentioned it in passing during the second week. A 72-year-old woman living alone on 40 acres on the basin's northern rim. He patrolled its sector. He'd driven within a mile of her property hundreds of times. He hadn't known her, had never had reason to stop, but the basin was not large enough, in the way human communities are never large enough, to make someone entirely abstract. She'd existed here. She'd grown things in the high desert and held on her land through a decade of widowhood and refused twice to sell to people who wanted it. And then she'd disappeared, and the machinery of the system had processed her absence and transferred her property and moved on. Cole had moved on too. Everyone had. That was the thing that sat heavy on him during those weeks. Not guilt exactly, because he hadn't known, but something adjacent to it. The weight of having been present in a place where something was happening and not seeing it. He mentioned this to Oakes during their 4th interview, not as a confession, but as a fact he wanted on the record. That he'd patrolled this basin for 11 years, and the quarry had been 100 yards off a road he drove every week. That he'd seen the tracks near the gate 6 years back and not followed up. Oakes listened to this without particular reaction. Then he said, "You found it when you found it." Cole said that wasn't quite satisfying. Oakes said satisfaction wasn't really the point. He wasn't wrong. Cole knew he wasn't wrong. But the knowing didn't make the weight lighter, which was probably how it was supposed to work. The weight was the thing that made you more careful the next time. The weight was the point. By the end of the 3rd week, 5 of the 6 names in the notebook had been identified and interviewed. 3 were cooperating with investigators. 2 were not. Gerald Pruitt had retained counsel and was not speaking. Stuart Farwell had also retained counsel, but had, through that counsel, indicated a willingness to discuss certain matters in the context of a cooperation agreement, which was the legal system's particular way of describing a situation where someone understood that the water was rising and was trying to negotiate the height of the ladder. Douglas Cahill had been arrested on day 11, as Oakes had told Cole, on charges related to the initial findings at the quarry. Terrence Aldis had been arrested the same morning, found at a motel 60 miles from a basin. He'd checked in under his own name, which told investigators something about either his confidence or his state of mind, and they leaned toward the latter after the interviews began. Aldous was not a composed man under questioning. He was a man who had, for 9 years, operated under the protection of a structure that insulated him from accountability, and when that structure came apart, the insulation came with it. The charges against both men were expanded twice in the first 3 weeks, as the forensic accounting and the notebook analysis produced material that the prosecutor's office incorporated into the charging documents. By the end of week 3, the charges included counts that had nothing to do with land fraud or financial crimes, counts that were of the most serious category available under the state criminal code, and which carried mandatory minimum sentences that made the financial fraud charges look like parking tickets by comparison. Joel Voss was informed of each expansion by Briggs, who had taken it upon herself to keep the family updated in real time on the investigation's progress. She called Darlene and Joel together, usually at the house, usually in the kitchen, sitting at the same table where Darlene had found Raymond's note 14 years ago. Joel had told Briggs early on that he wanted to know everything, even the things that were hard, that he and his mother had spent 14 years without information, and that the absence of information was its own particular damage, and he'd rather have the difficult truth than the comfortable gap. Briggs understood that. She gave them what she could. Marcus flew back from the Northwest in the 3rd week, the older Voss son, now 31, who'd left the state after losing the ranch and built a life at a remove from the basin's particular gravity. He was quieter than Joel, or quieter in a different way, the quietness of someone who'd processed their grief alone and at a distance, and had now returned to share it with people who'd carried it up close. He sat at the kitchen table with his mother and his brother and listened to Briggs go through the case summary and didn't say much. But he stayed. He didn't leave again until after the first preliminary hearings, by which point he'd been in the basin for nearly 4 weeks, the longest stretch he'd spent here since he was 17. Darlene watched her older son and didn't say much either. But Cole, who heard about this later from Briggs, thought he understood something about what she was feeling. That the shape of the loss had changed. Not smaller. You couldn't make it smaller. But more defined, with edges and a history and a cause. And there was something in that definition that was different from the formless thing she'd been carrying for 14 years, the not knowing that took on whatever shape her worst fears suggested on any given night. Now she knew. It was brutal knowledge. But it was real, and real things could be held and examined, and eventually, in whatever time that took, set down. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The preliminary hearings drew reporters from the regional press and eventually from outlets considerably further away. The case had accumulated the particular combination of elements that made it newsworthy beyond the local, land fraud and missing persons, and the remote high desert setting and the detail, which was the detail that seemed to capture attention most consistently, of an 11-year ranger who'd found everything by noticing a set of tire tracks on a road he knew by heart. Cole did not seek out the reporters, and they found him anyway. He spoke carefully and briefly and directed specific questions to the public information officer for the investigation. He said he'd done his job, and the investigators had done theirs, and the legal process would do what it was designed to do. He said this in various ways in various contexts, and it was genuinely what he believed, which made it possible to say without it sounding like a prepared statement, because it wasn't. What he didn't say in public, and what came up in a long conversation with Briggs during the 4th week when the immediate intensity of the investigation had settled into the slower rhythm of legal proceedings, was that he'd been thinking about the access road, about all the access roads, about the 60,000 acres he patrolled, and the assumption he'd carried for 11 years that the things that didn't belong would make themselves visible if you paid attention, and how the quarry had complicated that assumption without exactly disproving it. Briggs listened to this and said she thought he was being harder on himself than the situation warranted. She said investigations into this type of operation always produced the same retrospective feeling, the sense that the signs had been there and the right eyes hadn't found them. She said that was partly true and partly illusion, that concealment operations of this sophistication were specifically designed to produce that feeling, that the invisibility was the product of deliberate effort by people who understood what attention looked like and stayed out of its field. Cole said he took her point. She said she meant it. They sat for a while in the parking lot of the county courthouse where they'd met for the debrief. It was late afternoon, and the high desert light was doing what it did in late autumn, going gold and horizontal and making everything look temporarily significant. He asked her how many cases like this she'd worked. She thought about it. 3, she said. Not exactly like this. Similar in structure. Different circumstances. He asked if they'd all resolved. She said they'd all proceeded. Resolution was a different question. The legal process resolved. The rest of it took longer. He understood what she meant. He'd been watching Darlene Voss from a distance through the early weeks of the investigation. The way you watch things in a small community from the outside, and what he'd seen was someone working through a process that had nothing to do with courts or charges or arraignment schedules. Something older and more internal. The kind of work that got done in kitchens at night, and in conversations with sons who'd come home from a long way away, and in the particular silence that follows the moment when the worst thing you suspected is confirmed and becomes, finally, something you can name. The name didn't make it better, but it made it different. And different, Cole had come to believe, was the beginning of the long road to whatever better eventually looked like. The Hollowell situation produced a different kind of complication. Patricia Hollowell had no living close relatives. Her estate had been through the state escheat process, and her property had been acquired and absorbed. There was no Joel, no Marcus, no Darlene to sit in a kitchen and receive the information and begin the work of integrating it. There was a distant nephew in another state who'd been notified when she'd gone missing and had, by all accounts, done what he could through the appropriate channels before concluding there was nothing more he could do and returning to his own life. Briggs tracked him down and called him in the 5th week and had the conversation. He received the information with what Briggs described as quiet grief, the grief of someone who'd never been close enough to be devastated but was close enough to be marked by it. He asked what would happen with the estate. Briggs told him that was a matter for the courts and the state attorney general's office, that the escheat transfer had been achieved through a process now under serious scrutiny, and that the ultimate disposition of the property was part of the civil case that was running parallel to the criminal proceedings. He thanked her and said he'd be consulting an attorney. She said that was a good idea. The civil case was, in its way, as complex as the criminal one. Basin Meridian Land Partners had spent 9 years assembling a portfolio of basin properties, and the mechanism by which several of those properties had been acquired was now the subject of civil litigation that named not just Cahill and Aldis, but the financial institutions that had facilitated the debt transfers, the county officials whose records had been improperly influenced, and the shell entities through which the operation had moved its payments. The pension funds that Nourish had identified as investors in the Basin Meridian structure had retained their own counsel and were simultaneously pursuing claims and defending against claims, which was the way large financial entanglements tended to resolve themselves, in a fog of simultaneous aggression and self-protection that took years to navigate. Cole didn't follow the civil case closely. It was beyond his pay grade in both the literal and figurative sense. What he followed, with the particular attention of someone who'd been present at the beginning, was the criminal case and the people most directly affected by it. Joel Voss had taken a leave from the feed store. He'd been approached by 2 different civil attorneys about the family's potential claims against the Basin Meridian estate and its associated entities, and navigating those conversations while also tracking the criminal proceedings while also being present for his mother was a load that would have bent most people. Joel carried it with the same stillness he'd brought to the courthouse, not without effort. Cole didn't think it was effortless, but with a consistency of purpose that suggested he'd made some internal decision about how he was going to move through this period and was executing it. Marcus had come back again. After the first extended visit, he'd returned to the Northwest, but 6 weeks after the quarry discovery, he'd called the feed store and told Joel he was moving back. He said he'd been thinking about it for a while, that the distance had made sense when he needed it and didn't make sense anymore. He got a job with a construction contractor 40 miles from town, close enough to be at the house on short notice if anything required it. Darlene didn't say much about this development, but Briggs, who visited regularly through the early months, noticed that the rental house felt different, less compressed. The particular weight that had accumulated in its rooms over 14 years was not gone. Would not be gone for a long time, if ever. But it was distributed differently. 3 people carrying it instead of 1. Cole drove the basin through all of this. His routes didn't change, and his methods didn't change, and the work was what it had always been: maintenance and observation and the patient repetition of roads driven hundreds of times. He'd requested a review of all the access points to closed or inactive sites within the reserve boundaries, which the district supervisor had approved and which produced a list of 11 locations requiring upgraded security measures. He worked through the list systematically over the course of 6 weeks. He did not find anything at the other 10 locations. He hadn't expected to, but he found it important to check. The arraignments produced not guilty pleas from both Cahill and Aldis, which surprised no one. The preliminary hearings established probable cause on all counts. The district attorney's office announced that it would seek the maximum available sentences, which in the case of the most serious charges was not a number that left much room for negotiation. Cahill's defense attorneys filed a series of motions challenging the admissibility of the notebook and the circumstances of the strongbox's discovery and the chain of custody for the cargo van's contents. All of these motions were the standard machinery of a complex criminal defense, and none of them were unexpected. The judge assigned to the case, a woman named Teresa Colden, who had been on the bench for 17 years, disposed of most of them efficiently and scheduled trial for the following spring. Gerald Pruitt stopped not talking in week 7, after his attorney apparently reached the conclusion that the cooperation window was closing and that the difference between cooperating now and cooperating after Farwell finished his negotiations was considerable. Pruitt's statement to investigators ran to 67 pages. It took 2 full days of interviews to record. It confirmed the notebook's contents with respect to the quarry operations and added material about 4 separate instances across the 9-year period when the quarry had been accessed using his road department equipment and credentials. It named the dates and the circumstances and the other individuals present at each instance. It was Oakes told Cole on a call that was technically outside the proper information chain, but which Oakes apparently felt Cole was owed: comprehensive. The word he used was comprehensive. Cole understood what that meant. Farwell's cooperation agreement was finalized in week 9. His information was less operational than Pruitt's and more structural, relating to the investigation files and the information flow that had kept the Voss and Hollowell missing person cases from developing into anything that might have intersected with Basin Meridian's operations. He confirmed that he'd received payments through the shell entity Norrish had identified, and he named 2 other individuals within the former law enforcement structure of the county who'd been aware of the arrangement to varying degrees. One of those individuals had already left the state. The other was still local and was arrested in week 10. The news coverage intensified with each arrest. The regional press had been consistent from the beginning. This was a major story in the basin and the surrounding area, the kind of story that surfaced real grievances about the land acquisition practices that had affected ranching families across the Western High Desert for decades. But by week 10, the story had national reach, picked up by outlets that covered financial crime and rural land use and the intersection of corporate power with isolated communities. The framing varied depending on who was doing the framing. Some coverage emphasized the predatory finance angle. Some emphasized the law enforcement corruption angle. Some emphasized the human story of the Voss family and Patricia Hollowell and the 14 years of not knowing. Cole was careful about which of these framings he engaged with when reporters approached him, which they continued to do periodically through the winter. He didn't have a problem with the coverage. He understood its value, but he was aware that coverage had a tendency to simplify the things it described in ways that were useful for coverage and less useful for the people living inside the events being covered. What happened to the Voss family was not a symbol of anything larger, not primarily. It was what happened to a specific family, a specific man who'd found a second set of books and tried to do something about it, and specific people who decided to stop that from happening. The larger meaning, the structural critique, the policy implications, all of that was real and worth discussing. But it was secondary to the primary reality of Raymond Voss and Patricia Hollowell and the people they'd left behind. He said a version of this to a reporter from a national outlet who'd driven out to the basin and caught him at the ranger station one afternoon. She was good at her job, asked better questions than most, and listened to his answer without immediately pivoting to the follow-up she'd planned before he finished. She wrote the story she'd come to write, and it was not unfair. But in the published version, Cole's comment about the primary reality had been reduced to a sentence that preceded a longer passage about the structural issues. He didn't blame her. That was how it worked. You said what you meant, and then it entered a process that had its own logic and its own requirements and came out the other side as something that was related to what you'd said but not identical. That was most things when you got down to it. The winter passed. The basin went into its cold season, the high country white and the access roads icy in the mornings, and the work of the patrol taking on the particular focus quality that cold weather required. Cole drove his routes and checked his sites and filed his reports and let the legal process proceed at its own pace, which was slow and thorough and entirely out of his hands. Joel Voss called him in February. It was a brief call, professional in the sense that Joel identified himself clearly and stated his purpose, which was to ask if Cole would be willing to testify at the trial as a fact witness regarding the discovery of the quarry site. Cole said yes. Joel thanked him and started to end the call, and then paused and said one more thing. He said that his mother wanted him to pass along that she was grateful. Not for finding the quarry, specifically, though she was grateful for that too, but for the way Cole had handled himself through the whole process, for the care he'd taken in the interviews, for the fact that he'd stayed at the scene until Briggs cleared him even after his own immediate role was finished. She noticed that, Joel said. She wanted him to know. Cole sat with the phone in his hand after the call ended and thought about Darlene Voss at the kitchen table with her hands folded, saying I knew. The terrible clarity of that. The 14 years of carrying a knowledge she couldn't confirm and a hope she couldn't quite extinguish, and the daily work of living between those two things. He thought about Raymond on the fence line in the afternoon sun, saying he'd found something. The decision to take it to a lawyer, which was a decision made by a man who believed in the instruments available to him, in the ordinary processes of accountability that were supposed to exist for exactly this kind of situation. A reasonable belief, held by a reasonable man, in a situation that had been constructed specifically to frustrate it. Cole spent a long time in the winter thinking about that, about the distance between what should have been available to Raymond and what had actually been available to him, about the 6 names in the notebook and the structure that had made those 6 names possible, and the other structures, the ones that weren't in any notebook that made that kind of structure possible in the first place. He didn't have conclusions about any of it. He wasn't sure conclusions were the right frame. He had observations and questions and the kind of discomfort that came from looking at something you couldn't look away from and not being able to resolve it into anything clean. He thought that was probably appropriate. Clean resolution was something that happened in stories told after the fact, shaped and edited for coherence. Real things stayed complicated longer. Spring came to the basin the way it always came, abruptly and then all at once. The high country shedding its snow in the space of 2 warm weeks. The access roads muddy and then dry and then cracked again. Cole drove the patrol routes, and the grass was coming up in the lower elevations, and the birds were back in numbers, and the basin looked the way it always looked in April, immense and indifferent, and genuinely beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with anything that had happened in it. The trial began on the 14th of April. Cole was on the witness list and would testify during the 2nd week of proceedings, which gave him 2 weeks of attending to his work while the opening arguments were made and the prosecution began laying its case. He followed the coverage in the evenings and read the daily summaries that Briggs sent to the people she designated as formal participants in the investigative process. He found the legal proceedings absorbing in the way he found all detailed technical processes absorbing, the building of arguments from evidence, the examination and cross-examination, the gradual accumulation of a record that would outlast the proceedings themselves. Cahill's defense had settled on a strategy of compartmentalization, arguing that Cahill had been unaware of the specific operational decisions made by Aldous, that the corporate structure of Basin Meridian placed Aldous' activities outside the scope of Cahill's direct knowledge, and that the financial crimes, which Cahill's attorneys were now more or less conceding in general terms, did not establish the knowledge required for the most serious charges. It was a technically sophisticated defense, and it was being executed by attorneys who were technically sophisticated. Whether it would work was a question that the jury would eventually answer, but the prosecution's response, led by an assistant district attorney named Victor Harlan, who had apparently prepared for this case with the intensity of someone who understood what was at stake, was methodical and well-documented, and proceeded on the theory that the notebook was the jury's guide to everything they needed to know. Harlan used the notebook the way a good teacher uses a primary source, walking the jury through it entry by entry, establishing the pattern, connecting each notation to a corresponding piece of corroborating evidence. He didn't rush. He let the record accumulate. By the end of the first week, Cole thought, based on the coverage he was reading, that Harlan had built something that was going to be very hard to argue around. Aldis had changed strategy in late March, firing his original counsel and retaining a new attorney who'd immediately entered discussions with the prosecution about a cooperation agreement. Those discussions were ongoing when the trial began. His original not guilty plea remained technically in place, but the coverage made clear that a resolution on Aldis's charges was likely before the trial concluded. What that resolution would look like and what Aldis would provide in exchange for it was not yet public. Cole testified on a Thursday morning in the third week. He took the oath and sat in the witness chair and answered Harlan's questions about the morning of the discovery with the same factual precision he brought to every interview. What he'd seen, what he'd done, the sequence of events from the tire tracks to the call to Oaks. He was a clean witness. Harlan had told him in the prep session, meaning he said what he knew and nothing more and didn't elaborate past the question. Cole thought that was the only sensible way to testify, but understood that not everyone managed it. The cross-examination was brief. Cahill's lead attorney asked him 3 questions about the gate's condition and whether Cole had touched anything before. Law enforcement arrived. Cole answered truthfully, which was that he'd picked up one document from the van floor while wearing his work gloves and had set it down when he realized what it was. The attorney made a note of this. Cole had disclosed it in every interview, and it was in every report. It wasn't a problem. The attorney apparently decided it wasn't a problem either, because he had nothing else. After his testimony, Cole sat in the gallery for the remainder of that morning session. He hadn't planned to, but he found himself not ready to leave. He watched Harlan examine a financial crimes expert about the structure of the shell entity payments. He watched Cahill's attorneys object and be overruled twice. He watched Cahill himself at the defense table, 63 years old in a good suit, with the particular expression Cole had seen on a handful of people in his career who'd been caught doing something they believed was uncatchable. Not quite disbelief and not quite resignation. Something between them. The expression of a person revising, in real time, the story they'd told themselves about how the world worked. Joel Voss was in the gallery too. Cole had nodded to him when he sat down. Joel had nodded back. They hadn't spoken. There wasn't anything that needed saying. They were both there for the same reason, the same fundamental reason, which was that being present mattered. That the process of accountability required witnesses. That you didn't leave just because your official role was finished. Darlene was not there. She told Briggs she didn't think she could sit in a room with the men responsible for what had happened to Raymond and maintain the composure required. Briggs had told her that composure was not required, that she was entitled to whatever she felt in that room. Darlene had thought about it and decided she'd wait. There would be a verdict. There would be a sentencing. She would be present for those. The trial itself, the proceedings and the arguments and the technical machinery of prosecution and defense, she'd leave that to Joel and Marcus and the people whose job it was. Marcus was in the gallery too, Cole saw, when he scanned the room, sitting on the other side from Joel with the same still attention his brother brought to everything. The 2 Voss sons in the same room where the case against the men responsible for their father's death was being made, piece by piece, document by document, in a methodical language of criminal proceedings. Cole sat with them, not next to them, but in the same room, until the noon recess. Then he got up, walked out of the courthouse into the spring light, and drove back to the basin. The quarry access road was passable again, the winter erosion having been graded by the county road crew in March as part of their standard spring maintenance. Cole drove to the gate, which had been replaced and re-padlocked with a new chain as part of the investigation site management, and stopped there. He didn't go in. He sat with the engine running for a few minutes, looking at the switchback road descending into the rock. The forensics team had been off the site for 2 months. The vehicles had been removed. The strongbox and its contents were in evidence. The documents were in evidence. What remained was the quarry itself, the 60-meter walls and the floor, and the morning light that came in at an angle through the open top. In a few months, after the legal proceedings had reached a point where the site was no longer needed as an active location, the question of what to do with the Harlow Quarry would come up in some planning process somewhere, and people would have opinions about it, and something would be decided. Cole didn't know what he thought should happen to it. He wasn't sure that was his question to answer. But he thought about Patricia Hollowell and the 40 acres on the northern rim and the man who'd come to her door twice with offers she'd refused, and he thought about what it meant that the basin had held her story the same way the quarry had held what it held, not hiding it exactly, but containing it in a space that required someone to look. He'd looked. He tried not to attach too much to that, tried to keep it at the scale it belonged to, which was the scale of a person doing their job carefully on an ordinary morning. But he was human, and human beings attached meaning to things, and what he attached to the tire tracks and the cut lock and the cargo van and the notebook was the particular significance of attention, of noticing, of following the thing that didn't belong. He'd been a ranger for 11 years, and he'd spend many more years being a ranger, driving these roads and checking these sites and doing the patient work of watching over 60,000 acres of high desert that most of the world would never see. The work was mostly routine. That was the truth of it, and he didn't dress it up. Mostly routine, and then occasionally not, and the mostly routine was what made you ready for the occasionally not. He put the truck in gear and drove back toward the patrol route. The basin spread out on either side of him, the spring grass coming up green in the low spots, and the juniper still that particular blue-gray that it held through all seasons. The meadowlarks were back. The sky was the specific high-altitude blue that you couldn't get at lower elevations, a color that had no name that did it justice. He had 4 more sites to check before end of shift. He checked them all. The verdict came on a Wednesday afternoon in the 5th week of trial, delivered by a jury of 11 women and 1 man who had sat through 41 days of testimony and argument, and the particular exhaustion of being asked to hold a complex and terrible story in their heads for an extended period of time. Cole was on patrol when his phone rang. Briggs, calling from the courthouse steps. She didn't lead with preamble. Guilty, she said. All counts. He pulled the truck to the side of the access road and sat for a moment. The juniper was motionless in the still afternoon air. A hawk turned slow circles over the scrub a quarter-mile ahead, riding a thermal that Cole couldn't see but knew was there. Both of them, he said. Aldous had finalized his cooperation agreement in week 4 of the trial, pleading guilty to a negotiated set of charges in exchange for his testimony against Cahill. So technically Cahill was the only defendant the jury had deliberated on. But Briggs understood what Cole was asking. Both of them, she said. Cahill by jury. Aldous by plea. The others are in various stages of the process. Gerald Pruitt's sentencing is next month. Farwell the month after. Cole said he was glad she called. She said she'd thought he should hear it directly. After he hung up, he sat with the truck, idling for another few minutes. He thought about the morning 6 months ago when he'd come around the bend and seen the tire tracks and the caliche dust, the particular quality of wrongness they had against the pale earth, the way his 11 years of reading this landscape had registered them immediately as something that didn't fit. He thought about the descent down the switchback, the 2 plateless vehicles on the quarry floor, the cargo van's open rear doors. The paper in his hand with Basin Meridian Land Partners at the top of the letterhead. He thought about Raymond Voss on the fence line, saying he'd found something. He started driving again. He had sites to check. The work was ongoing, and the work was the work. The sentencing hearings extended through the summer. Cahill received 43 years on the combined counts, a sentence that his age made effectively a life sentence, which the judge noted explicitly in her remarks from a bench. She used language that was measured and precise and not theatrical, but she did not avoid the weight of what she was saying. She said that the harm caused by the conduct before her was not limited to the financial crimes, which were themselves serious, but extended to the destruction of human lives and the corruption of the public institutions meant to protect those lives. She said that the mechanisms of concealment Cahill had employed were not the work of a person who had made a terrible error in judgment, but of a person who had constructed, maintained, and expanded a system of harm over nearly a decade, with deliberate effort and at considerable expense. She sentenced him to the maximum available on each count, running consecutively where the law permitted. Cahill stood through the sentencing without obvious expression. His attorney had submitted a statement on his behalf expressing remorse. Cahill did not speak. He was led from the courtroom in custody, and that was the last Cole heard of him, except through the occasional update in the legal proceedings that continued on the civil side. Aldous received 26 years under the cooperation agreement, reduced from what he would have faced without cooperation by approximately half. His testimony had been central to the prosecution's case against Cahill on the most serious counts, providing the operational detail that the notebook suggested but didn't fully establish. He had spoken in a flat, precise voice during his testimony, according to the coverage Cole read, with the effect of someone who had made a decision to be completely factual and was executing the decision with the same methodical quality he'd apparently brought to everything else. His attorney had submitted a statement describing his client's remorse as genuine. The assistant district attorney had submitted a statement describing his client's cooperation as thorough. Joel Voss was at the Cahill sentencing. He'd asked Briggs if he could give a victim impact statement on behalf of the family, and she'd worked with the victim services coordinator to arrange it. He stood at the podium in the courtroom with his hands at his sides and spoke for approximately 8 minutes without notes. Cole had not been at the sentencing in person, but read the transcript that Briggs sent to the investigation participants. He read Joel's statement twice. Joel talked about his father, not about the crime, not about the perpetrators, not about the legal process, about Raymond Voss the person, about the way his father had moved through the world, quietly and with a particular kind of dignity that didn't require acknowledgement from anyone else to sustain itself. He talked about a morning when he was 12, before the drought years had accumulated their full weight, when his father had taken him to check the east fence line, and they'd found a section knocked down by a fallen cottonwood. And instead of being frustrated, Raymond had spent the better part of an hour examining the tree and talking about how old it was and what the ring pattern in the exposed would said about the wet years and the dry years in the basin going back before either of them was born. Joel said he'd thought about that morning hundreds of times in the years since his father disappeared, not because anything remarkable had happened, but because it was exactly the kind of morning that a 14-year-old boy doesn't understand he's storing, doesn't understand he'll return to for the rest of his life. He said his father had found something in a set of documents and had decided to take it to a lawyer because that was the kind of person Raymond Voss was. A person who believed in the instruments available to him. A person who thought that telling the truth to the right people would produce the right result. Joel said he did not know whether to call that belief naive or admirable, and that he'd spent 14 years going back and forth between those two words. He said he'd landed, finally, on admirable, that the belief had been wrong in its outcome, but not in its nature, that a world in which people didn't hold that belief was worse than the world Raymond had inhabited, even given what that belief had cost him. He said he missed his father every day and would miss him for the rest of his life, and that no sentence handed down in that courtroom would change that, and that he didn't expect it to. He said he was there because being present mattered, because the process of accountability required witnesses, because Raymond Voss had stood for something and deserved to have someone stand for him. Cole read that line twice. Darlene was at the sentencing, seated in the front row of the gallery with Marcus beside her. She did not give a statement. She had told Joel she would be there, and she was there, and that was the statement she chose to make, the statement of presence, of not looking away. Marcus had his arm around her shoulders through the sentencing remarks, and she sat very straight and kept her eyes on the judge. After the hearing, in the courthouse corridor, Briggs brought Darlene and Marcus and Joel together with Cole for the first time. He'd met Joel briefly and spoken to Briggs regularly, but he'd never been formally introduced to the family as a group. It was an unremarkable meeting in logistical terms, a corridor outside a courtroom on a summer afternoon, handshakes and brief words. Darlene was smaller than he'd imagined, with the same dark eyes as her son's and a stillness that reminded him of the basin in winter, not empty but held. She thanked him for finding what he found. He said he'd been doing his job. She said sometimes doing your job is the whole thing. She said it simply, without ceremony, and he understood that she meant it precisely that way. Not as praise and not as comfort. As a fact she'd arrived at through 14 years of thinking about the difference between the people who'd done their jobs and the people who hadn't. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said thank you and meant it. Marcus shook his hand and said the same. Joel had already said everything he needed to say from the podium. He nodded at Cole, and Cole nodded back, and that was the right amount. The civil case moved on its own schedule through the summer and into the fall, the kind of sprawling multi-party litigation that produced its progress in small increments and required a particular patience to follow. Cole followed at a distance, reading the summaries Nourish sent periodically to the people she'd identified as having an interest in the proceedings. The pension funds had largely settled early, their exposure managed through a combination of payment and structural reforms that their attorneys had negotiated with the state. The bank officers who'd facilitated the debt transfers were in various stages of their own proceedings. The county officials whose records had been improperly influenced had resigned or been removed, and the state audit of the county's land transaction records from the relevant period was ongoing. The Voss family civil claims against the Basin Meridian estate and its associated entities were consolidated with similar claims from 4 other families whose land acquisitions had been achieved through the same predatory debt mechanisms, though without the additional conduct that had produced the criminal charges. Those 4 families had lost land and received below-market compensation and had limited legal recourse at the time because the mechanisms used against them were, as Cole had come to understand, carefully constructed to be technically legal. The civil case sought to establish that the legal technicality didn't resolve the underlying harm, and the outcome of that argument would determine whether those families received anything beyond the amounts they'd already been paid. Cole thought about those 4 families sometimes on his patrol routes. Ranchers who'd lost land their fathers and grandfathers had worked and had no criminal case to point to, no notebooks and no quarry, and no set of tire tracks leading to an undeniable location. Just a slow legal argument about what fairness required in the aftermath of something that had been designed to be unfair without being illegal. It was a harder case to make and a harder outcome to predict, and he didn't know how it would resolve. He hoped it would resolve well. He thought that was probably the most he could honestly say. The Hollowell estate matter took its own path through the courts. The distant nephew, whose name was Robert Carver, and who was 51 and lived in another state and had never expected to be involved in anything of this complexity, had retained a good attorney and pursued the argument that the escheat transfer of Patricia Hollowell's property had been tainted by the investigation of the circumstances surrounding her disappearance, that the transfer should be reversed, and that the property should revert to the estate for proper distribution. Basin Meridian's receiver, managing the corporate estate through the bankruptcy that had been filed shortly after the criminal charges, had contested this position. The judge who handled the Hollowell estate matter was not Judge Cole then. He was a younger man named Arthur Price who had the reputation, according to the county courthouse community that Briggs moved through, of reading his cases carefully and taking his time and then deciding clearly and standing behind his decisions. He took 4 months on the Hollowell matter and then issued a 40-page ruling that reversed the escheat transfer, found that the circumstances of Patricia Hollowell's disappearance rendered the transfer procedurally void, and ordered the property returned to the estate. Robert Carver's attorney called him with the news on a Tuesday morning. Carver had told Briggs early in the process that he didn't expect anything, that he'd entered the case because someone had to represent Patricia's interests and there was no one else, not because he'd anticipated a favorable outcome. When the ruling came down, he was quiet for a long time on the phone with his attorney and then said he needed to figure out what the right thing to do was with the property. He took 3 months to figure it out. When he decided, he called Briggs and told her what he was planning. And Briggs told Cole, because she'd been telling Cole things throughout the process that she didn't strictly have to tell him, operating on the same principles she'd stated early on, that some people were owed information because of what they contributed, even when the formal structure of the proceedings didn't require it. What Carver had decided was that he would donate Patricia Hollowell's 40 acres to a land trust that operated in the basin, with a deed restriction requiring that the land be maintained in its natural condition and never developed or sold. He said he'd never known Patricia well, but he knew she'd refused to sell twice, which told him something about what the land had meant to her, and that the right use of it was to make it permanent in the way she'd been trying to make it permanent when she refused those offers. Cole drove out to the northern rim a few days after Briggs told him this. He'd looked up the parcel, knew roughly where it was, had driven within a mile of it thousands of times without knowing its particular history. He parked on the nearest access road and walked in through the juniper and the scrub grass to the edge of the property, identifiable by the old fence line that still marked its boundaries, the wire rusted but the posts still standing. 40 acres of high desert. The basin visible to the south and west, spreading out in its enormous, indifferent way. The light in the late afternoon doing what it always did, going gold and horizontal and significant. A red-tailed hawk on a fence post 30 yards away, watching him with the calm assessment of a creature that had no stake in the proceedings. He stood there for a while. He'd never met Patricia Hollowell. He knew what he knew about her from the investigation, from the missing person file and the basin's scattered memory of her and the fact of her 2 refusals, which was more than most people knew, but less than anyone who'd actually known her. He didn't feel qualified to stand on her land and attach a meaning to it, but he felt it was appropriate to stand there, the same way he'd felt it was appropriate to stay at the quarry scene after his official role was finished. Being present mattered. The place deserved a witness. He walked back to his truck and drove the patrol route. In October, nearly a year after the morning of the tire tracks, the Harlow Quarry site was formally released from its status as an active crime scene. The state had been managing it as a protected location through the entirety of the criminal proceedings, and with the sentencings complete and the evidence properly archived, there was no longer a procedural requirement for continued restriction of access. The question of what to do with it came to Cole's desk in the form of a memo from the district supervisor asking for his recommendation on the site's long-term management. It was a straightforward facilities management question in its framing, the kind of question that came up periodically about inactive sites within the reserve, and Cole could have answered it in that register, with a recommendation about gate security and access protocols and inspection schedules. He didn't answer it in that register. He wrote a 2-page memo that began with the site's physical characteristics and ended with the argument that the Harlow Quarry warranted a different kind of management consideration than a standard inactive industrial site. He argued that what had occurred there had produced a particular relationship between the site and the basin community, one that required acknowledgement rather than administrative management. He suggested that the State Historic Preservation Office be consulted about a formal designation that would recognize the site's significance. He noted that several families and individuals with direct connections to the site's history had expressed, in various ways through the proceedings, a desire for the site to be treated with a gravity appropriate to what it represented. He submitted the memo and went back to his patrol routes and didn't hear anything for 3 weeks. Then the district supervisor called and said she'd forwarded the memo to the state office and that someone from preservation had been in contact and wanted to discuss the recommendation. The discussion took several months and involved people Cole mostly communicated with by email, historians and preservation specialists and community relations staff from the state land office. It also eventually involved Joel and Marcus Voss, and in one phone consultation that Briggs arranged, Darlene, who had thoughts about what the site should and shouldn't be, and expressed them with the precision of a person who had spent a great deal of time thinking about the difference between remembrance and spectacle. What she said, as Briggs related to Cole afterward, was that she didn't want the quarry to become a destination. She didn't want tour buses. She didn't want a parking lot and interpretive panels and the apparatus of a site designed to be visited by people who had no connection to what happened there. She wanted something smaller and more specific. A marker, a record, something that said these people existed and this happened and the truth was found here, and then left the place to be what it was, which was a working part of the landscape, a feature of the basin that the basin's residents would encounter in the ordinary course of their lives, and not as a curated experience. Cole thought that was exactly right. The designation that emerged from the process was modest by the standards of formal historic designations. A small bronze plaque mounted on a stone base at the gate, visible from the access road without requiring entry. The language on the plaque had been drafted by a historian in consultation with Darlene and Joel and Robert Carver and approved by the Preservation Office and the district supervisor. It named Raymond Voss and Patricia Hollowell. It gave the dates of their disappearances and the date of the discovery. It said that the truth had been found here after 14 years through the ordinary work of attention. It did not editorialize. It did not use the word justice, which Darlene had specifically requested be omitted, on the grounds that justice was a claim about completion, and she wasn't ready to make that claim. Cole installed the plaque on a November morning, almost exactly 1 year after the morning of the tire tracks. He drove to the gate with the plaque in the truck bed and a post-hole digger and a bag of quick-set concrete. And he dug the hole and set the stone and mortared the plaque and stood back and looked at it for a while. Darlene and her sons came out that afternoon. No ceremony had been planned, no gathering. Joel had asked Cole when the installation was happening, and Cole had told him, and Joel had said they'd come by. They arrived in Marcus's truck, the three of them together, and stood at the gate and read the plaque without speaking. Darlene reached out and put her hand flat on the bronze, just for a moment. Then she took her hand back and folded it with the other one and stood looking at the gate and the switchback road descending into the quarry below. She said, "He would have been 65 this year." Joel said he knew. She said, "He never wanted much. He just wanted to keep the land and the family." Marcus said, "I know, Mom." They stood for a while. Longer. Cole stood nearby, close enough to be present and far enough to give them the space the moment required. The basin spread out around them in all directions, enormous and still, the November light going gold already at 4 in the afternoon. After a while, Darlene turned from the gate and looked at Cole with her dark eyes and the stillness she carried everywhere. She said, "You come out here sometimes, don't you? Even when you don't have to." He said he drove past most weeks, that the access road was on his regular route. She said, "Good." She said it the way she said most things, simply and without performance, meaning it precisely. "Good. Someone should." She thanked him again, and he thanked her again, and then the Voss family got back in Marcus's truck and drove north on the access road toward town, and Cole stood at the gate for a little while longer before he went back to work. The patrol route took him south and west into the lower basin, down into the canyon country where the rock formations changed from the pale limestone of the higher elevations to the darker basalt of the ancient lava flows, where the country was rougher and less traveled, and the sense of being genuinely far from the ordinary world was most complete. He drove through the late afternoon light, and the basin did what the basin did, which was to absorb the light and the time and the passage of human events into its enormous geological patience, holding everything without judgment, returning nothing. He'd read once, in a paper about the basin's formation, that the rock at the bottom of the Harlow Quarry's walls was approximately 240 million years old. Pre-dinosaur, pre-almost everything that most people thought of as history. The quarry had been cut through 240 million years of accumulated stone, and the thing that had been hidden at its base had been there for 14 years, which was nothing, which was a rounding error in the timeline of the basin's existence. And yet those 14 years had been someone's entire adult life, had been the span in which a boy became a man, and a woman cleaned houses until her knees gave out, and the truth stayed buried in the particular darkness of the place that held it. Cole thought about scale a lot in those months after the trial, about the difference between the geological patience of the basin and the human urgency of the people who lived in it. Both were real. Both were operating simultaneously. The trick, if there was one, was to hold both at the same time without using one to cancel out the other. The basin's indifference didn't diminish the human story. The human story didn't diminish the basin's scale. They coexisted the way things in the real world coexisted, without resolution, in parallel, each complete in itself. He wasn't sure he'd fully worked out what he thought about any of it. He suspected he wasn't supposed to fully work it out, that the appropriate response to what had happened in the basin that year was not a conclusion, but an ongoing attention, the same attention he brought to the patrol routes and the access roads and the occasional thing that didn't belong. The civil case involving the Voss family and the other 4 ranch families reached a settlement in December, 16 months after the morning of the tire tracks. The terms were not made fully public, but Briggs, operating in the mode she'd maintained throughout, told Cole that the settlement was substantial, that it included compensation for the undervalued land transactions and consequential damages, and a formal acknowledgement by the financial institutions involved that the mechanisms used against the basin's ranching families had been improper. The acknowledgement was the part that took longest to negotiate, she said. The money was easier than the acknowledgement. Money was just money. The acknowledgement was an institution admitting that it had done something wrong, which was a different kind of thing entirely. Joel Voss called Cole when the settlement was finalized. He didn't share the specific amounts, which Cole hadn't expected him to. He said the family was going to be okay. He said they were going to be able to do something with the money that his father would have recognized as meaningful, though he didn't say specifically what that was, and Cole didn't ask. He found out later, through the basin's small-town information network, that the Voss family had purchased a ranch. Not the original Voss property, which had been sold and resold and was now owned by a corporation that had bought Basin Meridian's assembled holdings through the bankruptcy process. A different ranch, smaller, on the basin's eastern edge. Marcus was running it. Joel was helping on weekends. Darlene had a garden. Cole drove past the eastern edge ranch on his patrol routes occasionally and saw the activity there. Vehicles in the yard and cattle in the lower pasture, and the signs of a working property coming back to life after a period of vacancy. He didn't stop, had no reason to stop. But the sight of it through the truck window, the ordinary industry of a ranch being worked, registered as something his 11 years of driving these roads had calibrated him to appreciate. Things that belonged. Things in their right place. It wasn't always possible. Often it wasn't possible. But when it was, the basin made room for it without ceremony, absorbed it back into the ongoing fact of itself, which was the only recognition the basin ever offered and was, Cole thought, recognition enough. He was 54 years old now, or would be in March. He'd been a ranger for 23 years, counting the seasonal work before he went full-time, and there was no version of his life he could construct that didn't have this landscape in it. The work had shaped him in the way long work at a thing shapes you. Not by changing your fundamental nature, but by developing certain capacities that wouldn't have developed otherwise. The patience of repetition, the attention that came from driving the same roads for decades, and learning to see them freshly each time, because freshly was the only way to see anything that required seeing. He thought sometimes about what he would have done if he'd been on a different route that November morning. If his patrol had taken him south instead of north, and the tire tracks had been there undisturbed for another week, another month. He ran the thought until it became unproductive and then set it down, the way you set down thoughts that led nowhere useful. He'd been on the route he'd been on. He'd seen what he'd seen. The rest of it was the kind of speculation that served no one. What he held instead was the conversation with Darlene at the gate. She said he drove past most weeks, and she said good, and she said someone should. He'd turned that over many times in the months since and hadn't found a bottom to it. Someone should, not as an obligation, not as a duty in the formal sense, but as the particular human practice of not forgetting, of maintaining an awareness of what had happened in a place and what that meant. The plaque on the stone at the gate did some of that work, the formal record, the permanent notation. But Darlene was talking about something in addition to the plaque. She was talking about presence. About the ongoing act of a person choosing to drive past and know what the place held. Cole understood that. He thought it was the thing he'd been doing for 11 years without a name for it. The practice of knowing the land he was responsible for not just as a physical inventory of sites and features, but as a place with a history that was still accumulating, still in the process of becoming what it would eventually be. The quarry was part of that history now. The tire tracks, and the cut lock, and the cargo van, and the notebook, and the trial, and the plaque. Part of the ongoing story of the basin, written in the same rock that had been here 240 million years, and would be here 240 million more. He drove his routes. He checked his sights. He noticed what was out of place and followed where it led, which was the whole of the job and had always been the whole of the job, and was enough. The spring after the plaque went up, Darlene Voss drove out to the quarry gate on a Sunday morning by herself. She didn't tell anyone she was going. She parked beside the gate and sat with her coffee thermos and read the plaque again, though she knew it by heart. She'd approved the language and knew every word and had read it 6 times since it went up. She read it again anyway. Raymond's name was first, then Patricia Hollowell's. The dates. The sentence about the truth being found through the ordinary work of attention. She thought a long time about that line and whether it was right, and had decided that it was not because it was the most eloquent thing that could have been said, but because it was accurate. That was what had happened. Someone had been paying attention on an ordinary morning, and the ordinary work of that attention had found what needed finding. She sat for a while with her coffee going cold, and the basin in front of her and the quarry behind the gate, invisible from where she sat, just a switchback road disappearing into the rock and the morning light on the pale dust. She thought about Raymond finding the second set of books. She'd never told anyone, not even Joel, what she actually believed had happened in the days between Raymond finding those records and his disappearance. She believed he'd gone to the lawyer. She believed the lawyer had told someone or the wrong person had found out some other way, and that the night it happened had not been an accident or a coincidence, but a response to a specific threat that the wrong people had decided to eliminate. She believed that Raymond had understood, at some point before the end, that his decision to act on what he'd found had produced consequences he hadn't foreseen, and that what he'd felt in those moments was not regret about the decision, but sorrow about what the decision had cost his family. She believed this because it was what she would have felt in his position, because she and Raymond had been married for 22 years, and she knew how he was made, the specific alloy of stubbornness and tenderness and quiet principle that he'd inherited from his father and passed to Joel. She didn't share this with anyone because it was hers. It was the interior version of the story, the one that no court record could confirm or deny, and it was hers to keep. The official version, the version in the charging documents and the trial transcripts and the plaque on the stone, was accurate in every fact. This version was true in a different way. The way things were true inside the people who carried them. She finished her coffee and put the thermos on the passenger seat and started the truck. Halfway back to the main road, she passed Cole Drayden's Forest Service pickup, heading the other direction on his Sunday patrol. He lifted 2 fingers off the steering wheel in the basin's standard greeting for people passing on access roads, the minimal acknowledgement of shared presence. She did the same. They didn't stop. There was no reason to stop. He was doing his job, and she was doing what she'd come out to do, and both things were complete in themselves. 2 people moving through the same landscape in parallel, each carrying what they carried, the basin indifferent and enormous and present around them. She drove back to the ranch. Marcus was already up, coffee made, working at the kitchen table on something related to the herd management software he'd been trying to learn. Joel was coming for Sunday lunch with a woman he'd been seeing for 4 months, a schoolteacher from 40 miles south, steady and good-humored and clearly good for him, which was the only assessment Darlene had needed to make. She had things to do. The garden needed attention, and the kitchen needed the kind of cleaning that a Sunday morning allowed for. She drove through the gate of the Eastern Edge Ranch and parked and got out and stood for a moment in the spring air. The pasture was green in the low spots. A pair of meadowlarks were doing something complicated in the grass by the fence line. The sky was a high-altitude blue that had no adequate name. She went inside to start the day. 60 miles north, Cole Drayden drove the access road past the Harlow Quarry gate without stopping, the way he drove past it every week, noting the plaque and the gate and the unchanged fact of the quarry beyond it, the 60-meter walls and the floor where the truth had waited 14 years to be found. He noted it and kept driving, his attention already moving ahead to the next site, the next stretch of road, the next thing that might or might not require his notice on this particular morning. The meadowlarks were back. The basin was enormous and still. Somewhere out in the scrub, the hawk Cole had watched turning circles on the November morning of the tire tracks, or one very like it, rode a thermal that rose from the warming desert floor and carried it higher and higher without any effort, the particular grace of a thing in its right element, going about its ordinary business in the place where it belonged. The second discovery happened 18 months after the first. Cole was not the one who made it. That distinction belonged to a woman named Anita Reyes, 31, a hydrological survey technician contracted by the State Water Board to assess groundwater movement in the basin's lower sector. She was running instrument transects along the old quarry access road on a Tuesday in May when her equipment registered an anomaly in the subsurface readings that she spent 40 minutes trying to explain away before she accepted that she couldn't explain away and called the number on the environmental oversight contact sheet she kept in the back of her field notebook. That number reached Cole's desk. He drove out within the hour and stood with Anita over her equipment readouts, which he was not trained to interpret in any technical sense, but which she walked him through with the patience of someone accustomed to explaining her work to people outside her field. What the instruments were detecting, she said, was a void. A significant one, not the quarry pit itself, which was accounted for in the subsurface mapping. Something separate, running roughly parallel to the quarry's western wall at a depth of about 12 meters, extending in a northeast direction away from the known pit boundary. "How long has it been there?" Cole asked. She said that was not a question her instruments could answer. He called Oakes. Oakes was no longer with the State Bureau in the same capacity. He'd been promoted in the wake of the Harlow case, moved to a supervisory position in the Serious Crimes Division, which meant he was no longer running field investigations himself. But he'd stayed in contact with Cole through the 18 months since the trial, the occasional check-in, updates on the civil proceedings, the kind of professional relationship that forms between people who've worked through something large together and find it easier to stay in contact than to let the connection lapse entirely. He listened to Cole's description of the anomaly and said he'd make some calls. The calls produced a state geological survey team within 4 days and a joint review process that took 3 weeks before anyone would commit to a formal recommendation about what should happen next. The survey team confirmed Anita's readings and added detail. The void was approximately 40 meters long, 8 meters wide at its widest point, and consistent in its structural characteristics with a constructed tunnel rather than a natural formation. The soil chemistry around the void boundary showed traces of concrete sealant, the kind used in mine construction. The Harlow Quarry, it turned out, had not been as thoroughly mapped as anyone had believed. The 1987 closure documentation referenced the main pit and the surface structures and the access road. It did not reference any lateral workings, which was the mining term for horizontal tunnels driven from a pit's walls to access or deposits that couldn't be reached from above. Lateral workings were common in quarry operations of the era. They were also frequently undocumented, driven on the judgment of the site foreman, and logged, if they were logged at all, in operational records that often didn't survive a company's bankruptcy. The Harlow Mining Company's bankruptcy records had been partially archived by the state and partially lost. What the geological survey team found, working through those archived records over 2 weeks, was a single operational log from 1983 that referenced a lateral working driven on the quarry's western face. The log gave dimensions and a bearing and a date range for the work. It did not give a reason for its abandonment, which was noted in the log simply as discontinued. There was no subsequent documentation. The working had been sealed with a concrete plug at its entrance, which the survey team's instruments could now identify in the subsurface readings as a denser formation at the eastern end of the void. Cole walked the surface above the void on a Thursday afternoon while the survey team ran their final instruments. The ground there was undistinguished high desert, juniper and scrub, and the same caliche dust as everywhere else in this part of the basin. Nothing that would have caught his attention on a patrol. Nothing that looked different from the surrounding terrain. That was the thing about this landscape. It kept its own counsel. It didn't advertise what it held. You could drive over a void for 11 years and never know it was there unless something told you to look. The investigation team reconvened with expanded membership. Briggs came back into the process, called by the district attorney's office to provide continuity from the original case. Norris returned on a consultancy basis, because if the lateral working contained anything connected to the original Harlow operation, the financial thread would need to be traced. Oakes came himself, in a supervisory capacity, managing the expanded team from a coordination role rather than the field. The decision about whether and how to open the concrete plug required sign-off from multiple agencies, which took another 2 weeks of meetings and memos, and the particular bureaucratic friction of a situation that fell across the jurisdictional boundaries of at least 4 state departments. Cole attended 2 of those meetings and said nothing useful, being present in the same capacity he'd been present at other things, because it felt important, and because sometimes the people who needed to make decisions needed to see the person who'd found the first thing in a room to remind them what this was actually about. The plug was opened on a Wednesday in June, a full 7 weeks after Anita Reyes had registered her anomaly. A concrete cutting team worked for 4 hours under the supervision of a structural engineer who was there to ensure that removing the plug didn't compromise the tunnel's integrity. Cole watched from the established safety perimeter, 50 meters back, standing in the morning heat with Briggs, and a state investigator who'd been assigned as the new lead on the expanded case. The plug came out in sections. The tunnel opening behind it was approximately 2 meters high and 1.5 meters wide, faced with timber framing that had deteriorated but not collapsed. A smell came out with the released air that Cole couldn't identify precisely, mineral and dry and faintly chemical, the concentrated product of a sealed space that had been closed for 40 years. The structural engineer went in first with a lighting rig. He was inside for 8 minutes. When he came out, he stood at the entrance for a moment looking at the lead investigator. "It's structurally sound," he said, "and it's not empty." What the lateral working contained took 4 days to fully document. Cole was not part of the documentation team, which was composed of forensic specialists and evidence technicians and a certified archivist from the State Historical Records Office who had been called in on the 2nd day after the first inventory produced results that exceeded the parameters of a standard forensic operation. He received briefings through Briggs. The first briefing, on day 1 of the documentation, covered the immediate physical contents. The tunnel extended the full 40 meters indicated by the survey instruments. Along its length, arranged in wooden crates and metal cabinets and freestanding stacks, were records. Not financial records in the sense of the cargo van's contents. These were operational records. Survey logs, geological assessments, mineral rights documentation, environmental impact reports, and internal communication from a span of decades that the archivist, on his first pass through the material, dated from roughly 1960 to the mid-1980s. Cole listened to this briefing and didn't immediately understand its significance. Then Briggs said the name. Kavanaugh Western Resources. He knew the name. Everyone in the basin knew the name. Kavanaugh Western Resources was the company that had held mineral rights across approximately 40% of the basin's western sector for the better part of 40 years before a series of legal challenges and regulatory changes in the 1990s had resulted in those rights being transferred to the state and eventually to various public land designations. The company had been the subject of sporadic controversy over the decades. Accusations of misrepresented survey findings and improperly obtained permits, and a relationship with state regulators in the 1970s and 1980s that multiple journalistic investigations had characterized as too close for comfort. Nothing had ever been definitively established, partly because the company's records had been cited as incomplete or unavailable whenever formal inquiries attempted to subpoena them. The records in the lateral working were the complete records. All of them. 40 years of operational documentation that had been reported as lost in a 1987 fire at Kavanaugh's regional office, a fire that had been investigated at the time and deemed accidental and had effectively ended several pending regulatory inquiries by eliminating the documentary basis for their continuation. The fire had been real. The archivist confirmed on day 2, after working through the earliest boxes, that the dates on the records predated the fire and that the inventory was consistent with what the regulatory agencies had been seeking at the time of the fire. Someone had moved the records before the fire. Someone had known the fire was coming or had planned the fire and had moved the records to the lateral working in the Harlow Quarry, which was at that time an active mining operation with which Kavanaugh Western had a contractual relationship for aggregate supply. The Harlow Mining Company had closed 4 years after the fire. The lateral working had been sealed. The records had been there ever since. The connection to the original Harlow investigation was not immediately obvious. The cargo van's contents and the strongbox had been entirely about Basin Meridian and the period from 2002 to the quarry discovery. Kavanaugh Western had been dissolved as a company in 1994, its principals long gone, its regulatory troubles resolved through the convenient absence of documentation. On the surface, the two sets of hidden records were coincidental, two separate acts of concealment in the same location, separated by decades. Norrish found a connection on day 3. Among the Kavanaugh Western records were partnership documents from the late 1970s listing the company's silent investors. Several of those investors were entities rather than individuals, limited partnerships, and holding companies whose beneficial ownership required additional tracing. Norrish was good at that kind of tracing. She'd spent 2 days on the first set of documents before she found the name she was looking for in a 1979 partnership agreement for a mineral rights acquisition vehicle. The name was Harold Cahill, Douglas Cahill's father. Harold Cahill had been a 34-year-old commercial real estate developer in 1979, building the base of what would become a substantial regional enterprise. He had invested in Kavanaugh Western's mineral rights acquisition vehicle through a holding company that bore no obvious connection to his name. The investment had been profitable over the subsequent decade, as Kavanaugh assembled its basin holdings. It had also, based on the internal communications in the boxes from the early 1980s, been accompanied by Harold's active involvement in the company's regulatory strategy, which was a polite way of describing what the communications actually documented. A sustained effort to maintain favorable relationships with state regulators through mechanisms that the communications described in language that required no translation. Harold Cahill had died in 2001. Douglas had inherited his estate, his business interests, and it now appeared his particular approach to the relationship between private capital and public oversight. Norrish presented this connection to the investigative team on day 4. Oakes listened to her summary with the expression Cole had seen on him before, the expression of confirmed suspicion, and then asked the question that Cole suspected had been forming in everyone's mind since day 1. Did Douglas know these records were here? Norrish said she didn't know yet. She said the documents in the cargo van, which had been analyzed extensively in the original investigation, contained no direct reference to the lateral working or its contents. But there were several references in those documents to the Harlow property itself that had been analyzed as relating to the quarry as a disposal location. Some of those references, in light of the lateral workings contents, might carry a different meaning. She said she'd need time to go back through the original van documents with this new context. Oakes said to take the time she needed. Cole received this briefing from Briggs on a Friday evening, sitting in his truck in the ranger station parking lot after she'd called. He sat with the phone in his hand for a while after she finished. He thought about Douglas Cahill at 63 in a good suit at the defense table, his expression during the sentencing. He thought about the notebook in Aldis's small, precise hand. 9 years of careful record, the payments calibrated to stay invisible. He thought about Harold Cahill in 1979, 34 years old, and already developing the instinct for the second layer, the structure within the structure, the thing held in reserve in case the visible thing failed. He thought about the lateral working sealed for 40 years while the basin moved through its seasons around it, the regulatory inquiries that had gone nowhere, the careers that had continued, the land that had changed hands under the auspices of rights documentation that the complete record might have told a different story about. He thought about the fire in 1987, deemed accidental, a fire that had solved a problem that someone had already solved another way, by moving what mattered before the fire was set. He thought about all the things the basin held that no one had found yet, or had found and decided not to follow, or had never known to look for. The specific limitation of his 11 years on a 60,000-acre patrol, the way the landscape scale made any individual's attention provisional and incomplete, covering what it covered and necessarily leaving the rest. He drove home. He didn't sleep well. He hadn't expected to. The lateral working investigation ran parallel to the expanded civil case that the new findings opened against the Cahill estate, which was still being administered through the bankruptcy proceedings from the original criminal conviction. The civil attorneys who'd been working the Basin Meridian claims against the financial institutions found themselves with new material, because the Kavanaugh Western records contained documentation of mineral rights transactions that had been cited in subsequent land valuations relied upon in exactly the kind of distressed debt operations that Basin Meridian had run decades later. The chain ran forward from Harold to Douglas, not directly, not through any single document, but through a pattern of practice and structure and the particular inheritance of a way of operating that passed between generations like any other asset. Norrish described it to Cole as institutional memory. She said some families accumulated financial capital across generations, and some accumulated social capital, and some accumulated a specific operational knowledge about how to use public systems for private benefit while insulating themselves from the formal consequences of doing so. She said Douglas Cahill had inherited all three. Cole asked her if she thought Douglas had known about the lateral working specifically. She said she now believed he had, not because any document directly said so, but because the references in the cargo van documents that she'd gone back to reanalyze included a notation in Aldis's hand that made more sense as a reference to the lateral working than it had as a reference to the main quarry. The notation said secondary hold, and she'd originally read that as an operational term relating to the disposal process. She now read it as a reference to the hidden records. She said she thought Cahill had known what his father had put in the tunnel and had chosen the quarry as a location precisely because it was already a place his family had used for concealment. That the choice of the Harlow Quarry was not coincidental but inherited a second-generation use of a first-generation solution. Cole absorbed this and said nothing for a moment. Then he said he thought the tunnel was still a secret. Yes, Norrish said. He had no reason to think anyone knew about it. The fire records, the closure documents, his father had been thorough. It had been hidden for 40 years without a problem. Why would the 41st year be different? Because of tire tracks, Cole said. She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. Because of tire tracks. The new charges against the Cahill estate were filed in September. Civil rather than criminal, given the principal's status. Douglas serving his sentence and Harold long dead. But the civil charges opened the question of asset recovery in a much broader sense than the original proceedings had, because the Kavanaugh Western records documented mineral rights transactions across the basin's western sector spanning 40 years, and the full picture of what those transactions had produced, who had benefited and how, was now a matter of active legal inquiry. Some of those transactions had produced royalties paid to Kavanaugh Western's investor vehicles over decades. Some of those investor vehicles had been dissolved and their assets distributed. Some of those distributions had found their way into the Cahill family's accumulated holdings. Tracing the full chain was work that Norrish estimated would take 18 months and involve multiple jurisdictions and a forensic accounting operation considerably larger than anything the original investigation had required. The State Attorney General's office, which had been involved in the proceedings since the original case, expanded its involvement significantly. A dedicated task force was formed. Norrish was named to lead the financial investigation component. Oakes remained in his supervisory role. Briggs continued as the county liaison, the thread of continuity running through the whole expanding process. Cole was not part of the task force. His role in what came next was limited to what it had always been: the patrol, the attention, the road he drove every week that happened to pass within 100 yards of the gate where the plaque was and the lateral working entrance beyond. He gave 2 additional depositions in the fall and was told he might be called as a witness in the expanded civil proceedings if they reached the discovery phase, which was expected but not certain. He drove the basin through that autumn with the particular awareness of someone who knew that the landscape's apparent stillness was provisional, that the accumulated history of what had happened here was still actively unfolding beneath the surface in both the metaphorical and now the literal sense. The lateral working ran under the ground he patrolled. The records it held were being processed in climate-controlled storage in the state capitol. The people they implicated were being identified one by one through the forensic accounting process. The basin didn't know any of this. The basin's 240 million year patience was indifferent to the timescale of human accountability, which was a thought Cole returned to more than once through those months. The indifference was not cruel. It was simply the nature of scale. What was enormous to the people inside, it was a rounding error in the basin's geological ledger. Both things were true. Neither canceled the other. He checked his sights. He filed his reports. He watched the season move through its changes, the high country going white again in October and the access roads requiring chains, and the particular winter quiet descending over the 60,000 acres he was responsible for. In November, exactly 2 years after the morning of the tire tracks, he drove the access road to the quarry gate at the start of a routine patrol. The morning light was in the same position it had been on that first morning, low and amber and stretching long shadows across the caliche dust. The plaque caught the light. Raymond Voss's name, Patricia Hollowell's name, the sentence about the ordinary work of attention. He stopped the truck and sat for a moment looking at it. 2 years. The trial, the sentencing, the lateral working, the new investigation. The Voss family on the Eastern Edge Ranch, cattle in the lower pasture, the ordinary industry of a working property. Robert Carver's gift of 40 acres on the northern rim to the land trust, permanent and protected. Darlene with her hands folded at this gate, saying someone should. He thought about the day he'd passed Darlene driving south on the access road. The two-finger lift off the steering wheel, the minimal acknowledgement. Two people carrying what they carried through the same landscape in the same direction at different speeds. He started the truck and drove the patrol route. The high desert was what it was, enormous and indifferent and genuinely beautiful in the low morning light. The juniper silver gray and the scrub grass catching the frost that had come down from the high country overnight. A coyote crossed the road a quarter-mile ahead and paused on the far side to look back at him with amber eyes before continuing into the scrub. Cole watched it go. Anita Reyes had called him the previous week with an update on her survey project. The groundwater work she'd been doing along the quarry access road had produced data that she was writing up for the State Water Board's annual assessment, and she wanted to know if there were any access restrictions coming in connection with the expanded investigation that might affect her fieldwork schedule. He'd told her about the access protocols, and she'd thanked him, and they'd been about to end the call when she said something that stayed with him. She said she thought about the anomaly readings sometimes. The morning she'd spent 40 minutes trying to explain it away. She said she'd had an advisor in graduate school who told her that the most important skill in field science was learning to recognize when you were explaining something away versus when you were actually explaining it. He'd said the difference was audible, that there was a specific quality to the internal voice that was trying to make an anomaly fit the expected picture versus the voice that was following where the data actually led. She'd thought about that distinction for years and had believed she understood it. And then she'd been standing over her instruments on that Tuesday morning with an anomaly that didn't fit any of her expected categories and had understood it in a completely different way. Cole had said he thought he knew what she meant, that there was something similar in patrol work, a quality of attention that was genuinely open versus a quality of attention that was performing openness while actually confirming what you expected to find. The tire tracks had been unambiguous. He'd seen them clearly and followed them clearly, but he'd also thought about the tracks he'd noticed 6 years earlier near the gate and hadn't followed. He thought the difference wasn't in the quality of his attention on those 2 mornings. He thought the difference was in what had been visible. 6 years ago, the chain had appeared intact. This time it hadn't. He'd followed what was there to be followed, and 6 years ago, what was there to be followed had been concealed well enough that it hadn't been there. That was a distinction that mattered. It was also a distinction that didn't fully resolve the weight he still carried about the 6 years. He'd thought about it enough to know it wasn't resolvable in the clean sense. It was simply one of the facts of a job, that the landscape held more than any single person could see, and that the practice of attention was real and important and also necessarily incomplete. Anita had said, "But you found it when you found it." He'd heard those words from Oakes 18 months earlier. He supposed they were true. They were also insufficient, and the insufficiency was part of the truth, and living with the whole of it rather than the convenient part was the only honest option available. He drove the patrol route. The state task force filed its first major civil action in January of the 3rd year. naming 14 entities and 7 individuals in connection with the Kavanaugh Western records and their implications for the basin's mineral rights history. The action sought the recovery of royalties improperly derived and the reversal of several property transfers that had relied on valuations based on misrepresented survey findings. It was a large action, larger than anything the basin had seen in its legal history, and it would proceed on a timeline measured in years rather than months. Cole followed it at the distance appropriate to his role, which was to say, at a considerable distance. Nora sent summaries when she thought he'd want them. Briggs called occasionally. Oak sent a message in February saying the task force was making progress and that the records and the lateral working were proving to be as significant as they'd initially appeared. Cole sent back a message that said he was glad and that he hoped everyone was well. He meant both things. Joel Voss called in March, the third March since the discovery. He and the woman he'd been seeing, the schoolteacher, had gotten engaged in December. He wanted Cole to know. He said it in the same brief, direct way he said most things, not as an announcement, but as an update shared with someone who'd been part of the events that preceded it. Cole congratulated him and meant it. Joel said his mother was happy. He said Marcus had expanded the herd and was talking about a second pasture on the ranch's eastern boundary. He said the ranch felt like something now, like a place with a future rather than just a place that had been acquired, and that the distinction mattered to him in a way he found hard to articulate, but that Cole would probably understand. Cole said he understood. After the call, he sat at his kitchen table, with the evening coming in through the windows, and thought about the particular quality of that word, future. The way it could be absent from a place or a family, and then present, not through any single event, but through the accumulation of decisions and recoveries and the ordinary work of people who hadn't stopped. Darlene with her garden, Marcus with his herd, Joel with his teacher and his plans for a second pasture. The basin absorbing all of it into its ongoing fact, indifferent to the human scale, but not hostile to it, making room for the things that grew where the ground allowed. He thought about Raymond Voss one more time, as he thought about him periodically, the fence line conversation and the second set of books and the decision to take it to a lawyer. He thought about what that decision had cost and what it had eventually produced, not in any transactional sense, not as a calculation of inputs and outputs, but as a fact about the world. That Raymond had known something was wrong and had tried to do something about it, and that the trying had mattered, had set in motion a chain of events that reached all the way to Anita Reyes's instruments on a Tuesday morning and the documents in a 40-year sealed tunnel and the task force filing in January. Raymond hadn't known any of that would happen. He'd known only that he'd found something and that the right thing was to pursue it through the instruments available to him, which was both a reasonable belief and an insufficient one given the specific situation he was in, and which was also the only honest option, the only option that a person of his particular character could have taken without becoming a different kind of person than he was. Cole respected that. He thought about it the way he thought about the basin's geological patience, as something that operated on a different scale than the events it was connected to, but was connected to them all the same. Raymond's decision in the autumn of 2009, the tire tracks in November of a year 14 years later, the lateral working in the June after that. A chain of ordinary acts, some of them costing everything, and some of them costing nothing more than a morning's careful attention, running through the basin's history like a vein of something valuable through common rock. The spring came again, the fourth one since the discovery, and with it the particular renewal that the basin's cold seasons made possible, the grass returning in the low spots, and the birds back in numbers, and the sky the specific high-altitude blue that had no name adequate to it. Cole drove his routes and checked his sights, and the work was what it had always been, patient and repetitive and occasionally not. He found two things that spring that required attention. Neither was connected to the quarry or the investigation or any of the preceding year's events. A cut fence on the eastern boundary that turned out to be the work of a rancher who'd been extending his grazing range illegally into reserve land, an issue that required a formal complaint and a boundary inspection and several conversations that ended with the fence restored and a fine issued, and a campfire ring in a restricted area on the southern rim, clearly used recently, that led, after some investigation, to a group of teenagers who'd been using the area on weekends and who required a conversation about fire risk and permit requirements and the difference between public land being accessible and public land being unmanaged. Ordinary work. The kind of work that made up the vast majority of 11 years, and then 15 years, and eventually however many years there would be. Cole did it with the same attention he brought to everything, because the attention was not a reserve to be deployed selectively on the significant occasions. It was the practice. It was the whole of it. He stopped at the quarry gate on the first Tuesday of every month, a habit he developed in the second year that he'd never formally articulated to himself but had maintained without interruption. He stopped and read the plaque, not because he needed to read it, but because stopping mattered, because the plaque named people who deserved to be named, and the naming deserved a witness, and he was the person who drove past every week, and so he was the witness available. Raymond Voss, Patricia Hollowell. The dates. The truth found here through the ordinary work of attention. He read it on a Tuesday in April of the fourth year in the same low morning light that had been on the basin the morning of the tire tracks. Amber and horizontal, and making everything briefly significant before it climbed to the overhead white of the high desert day. He put the truck in gear. The basin was enormous and still and absorbing the morning in its patient way. The juniper and the scrub grass and the caliche dust and the hawk riding the early thermal over the lower flats. The access road stretched ahead of him for miles, past the lateral working entrance now marked with a small survey flag that the state team had placed and never removed, past the turnoff to the northern rim where Patricia Hollowell's 40 acres held its permanent designation under the land trust deed, past the Eastern Edge Ranch, where Marcus Voss's cattle were visible in the lower pasture as small dark shapes against the spring green. Cole drove the route. The meadowlarks were everywhere this spring, more than he could remember in recent years, their yellow and black vivid against the brown scrub, their song the particular sound that the basin made in April when the season was genuinely arriving and not just threatening to. He drove with the windows down and the meadowlark sound coming in with the cold, clean air and the long shadows on the road ahead shortening as the sun climbed. He had 43,000 acres left in the day's patrol. 14 sites to check. 2 fence line inspections scheduled. A meeting in the afternoon with a graduate student from the state university who was doing a thesis on high desert bird populations and needed access to 3 monitoring stations in the southern sector. Ordinary work. The work of paying attention to 60,000 acres of landscape that held its history the way all landscapes hold their history, in silence, without advertisement, waiting for someone to notice. He noticed. That was the job. That was the whole of it. He kept driving. The graduate student's name was Priya Mehta, and she was 26 years old and had been studying high desert bird populations for 3 years without ever having reason to think about anything other than birds. She was not thinking about birds when Cole met her at the Southern Monitoring Station on that April afternoon. She was looking at the quarry gate plaque, which was visible from the station access road, and she had the expression of someone who has just read something that reordered the context of a place she thought she already understood. He'd seen that expression before. On Joel's face outside the courthouse. On Anita Reyes's face when she'd finally accepted what her instruments were telling her. The expression of a revised picture. Priya asked him about it while they were walking to the first monitoring station, her field notebook in one hand and her binoculars around her neck. She said she'd driven past the gate before without reading the plaque closely, and today she'd stopped and read it and looked up the case on her phone before driving to meet him. He gave her the short version, which took about 4 minutes. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, watching a pair of meadowlarks working a patch of scrub grass 30 meters off the trail. She said, "I've been out here 60 or 70 times over 3 years. I've run transects within 200 meters of that gate. I never knew." He said most people didn't. She said she supposed that was the point, that the not knowing was the design condition. That concealment wasn't passive, it was constructed, and constructed things required effort to undo. He said that was a good way to put it. They walked to the monitoring stations in the afternoon light, Priya checking her instruments and logging her readings while Cole stood at the perimeter of each station and watched the country. The meadowlarks were thick in this sector, more than he'd noted in his patrol logs in several years, and he mentioned this to Priya, who said her data confirmed it. She said the population had been recovering steadily over the past 4 years, and that the recovery correlated with a reduction in off-road vehicle activity in the southern sector, which had declined after a permit review that the Reserve District had conducted in connection with a broader land use assessment following the Harlow investigation. He hadn't known about that correlation. He filed it as information. At the third monitoring station, while Priya was downloading data from the logger, she asked him something that no one had asked him in 4 years of interviews and depositions and briefings and conversations about the case. She asked him what it felt like. Not what he'd found or what he'd done or how the investigation had proceeded. What it had felt like to come around that bend and see the tire tracks and the caliche dust on an ordinary November morning and understand, in the space of however many seconds it had taken, that the ordinary morning was not ordinary. He stood with the question for a moment. He said it felt like the landscape shifting under him. Not literally, but something in the way he understood the basin had changed in that moment. The 60,000 acres he'd been driving for 11 years had become suddenly different from what he'd believed them to be. Not the terrain itself. The terrain was what it always was. But his picture of it, his accumulated sense of what it held and what it didn't hold, had cracked at the gate where the chain was wrong and the tracks were fresh, and everything he thought he knew about the place required revision. He said he'd felt something similar when the lateral working was found. A second revision of a picture he'd thought was already revised. The basin offering another layer beneath the layer he'd found. Priya listened to this and wrote something in her field notebook, which struck him as slightly unexpected. She noticed him noticing and said she was writing it down because it was relevant to something she'd been thinking about in the context of her own field work. She said ecological survey work produced the same experience periodically. The moment when the dataset you'd been building for months or years revealed a pattern you hadn't anticipated, and the picture you'd been constructing required revision. She said the revision was always disorienting and always productive, and that the disorientation was actually the sign that real information was being received rather than confirmation of what you already believed. She said she thought that was probably true for most kinds of sustained attention. That the willingness to be disoriented was part of what made the attention genuine. Cole thought about that on the drive back to the ranger station. About the 6 years he'd spent driving past the quarry gate with the picture he had of the basin, complete and sufficient, the picture of a person who knew his territory well. The disorientation of November morning was not a failure of the 11 years before it. It was what the 11 years had made possible. You had to know a place well enough to recognize when something was wrong with it. The knowledge was the instrument. The revision was the instrument working. He thought about Darlene at the gate with her hand flat on the bronze plaque. About Joel at the sentencing podium with his father's eyes. About Marcus with his herd in the lower pasture and the spring green coming up around the cattle's legs in the April morning. He thought about Raymond Voss saying he'd found something and deciding to take it to a lawyer, which was both the thing that had cost him everything and the thing that had eventually made the tire tracks possible to follow, because the records Raymond had found and that Basin Meridian had spent 9 years trying to contain were the records in the cargo van. Moved to the quarry in the dark, the chain looped back through the gate hasp to fool a passing eye, the precaution that had not been sufficient because on a particular November morning a ranger with 11 years of knowing a landscape had come around a bend and seen 2 lines in the caliche dust that didn't fit the picture he carried. The chain of ordinary things, each one unremarkable on its own. Together, something. He parked at the ranger station and sat for a moment before going in. The late afternoon light was on the western range, the shadows long, and the high country beginning to show the last of its snow in the upper elevations where the season changed last. In a few weeks, the access roads would be clear all the way to the high country, and the summer patrol season would begin, and the work would expand to cover the full 60,000 acres without the winter restrictions. The work continued. That was the thing about it. It didn't conclude. The basin was not a case that closed. It was a landscape and ongoing process, its history still accumulating, its concealed things still waiting for the right instrument of attention to find them or not find them, in whatever time that took. He thought about what Priya had said about the willingness to be disoriented. He thought it was right. He thought it was the most honest description of the practice he'd heard in 4 years of people trying to describe it. This thing he did on 60,000 acres of high desert that was mostly routine and occasionally not. The willingness to have the picture revised. The willingness to follow the thing that didn't fit into the picture you'd been carrying, even when following it meant accepting that the picture had been wrong, even when the revision was large and the disorientation was real, and what lay at the end of the following was something you couldn't have anticipated on the morning you'd come around the bend and seen the tracks. He got out of the truck and went inside to file his patrol log. Raymond Voss, Patricia Hollowell. The dates on the plaque. The truth found here through the ordinary work of attention. He wrote his log in the same plain factual language he'd used for 15 years, noting what he'd seen and where and what, if anything, had required action. The fence inspection completed. The monitoring station access facilitated. The meadowlark population in the southern sector elevated, consistent with metasurvey data. He filed it. He went home. The basin held its history in the dark, in the rock, in the sealed and the buried and the carefully concealed. And every morning someone drove its access roads with the practiced attention of a person who knew the difference between what belonged and what didn't, following the ordinary work wherever it led. That was the whole of it. That was enough. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.